My parents ignored my graduation, calling it a failures ceremony. But when a $10 billion corporation recruited me directly with a $5 million month salary, everything changed. Mom called, "We need to talk. Family meeting tomorrow." I showed up with a surprise. They called it the failure ceremony. My college graduation, summa cum laude from Georgetown, 4 years of perfect grades, sleepless nights, and scholarship applications because my parents wouldn't pay a dime. I sent them an invitation 3 months in advance, handwritten, hopeful they didn't come. Instead, my mother posted garden party photos on Facebook during my ceremony, champagne glasses, designer dresses, my younger sister Emma laughing in the background, the caption, "Lazy Sunday Perfection." My father called 3 days later, not to apologize, to ask if I'd received their gift card. I hadn't, but his words, those I'll never forget: "Don't make such a big deal out of it, Olivia. It's just a degree. Thousands of people graduate every year." I was invisible, disposable, not worth 3 hours of their time until I wasn't. 6 years later, a $10 billion defense contractor sent me a direct recruitment offer. Lead AI ethics auditor, classified government work, $5 million per month. The kind of money that makes news and industry circles, the kind my parents' social network would definitely notice. 48 hours after the announcement went public, my phone rang, my mother's voice dripping with sudden warmth I'd never heard before. "Sweetheart, we need to talk. Family is important. Can you come to dinner tomorrow?" I should have said no. I should have blocked their numbers and moved on with my life. But I didn't, because 3 weeks earlier I'd opened a letter my grandmother left me. Before she died, inside was a secret one that would explain 30 years of rejection, destroy my family's perfect facade, and reveal a truth so devastating that when I finally walked into that family dinner, I wasn't coming as their daughter, I was coming as their reckoning. And trust me, you need to hear what happened when they saw what I brought with me. My name is Olivia Carter. I'm 34 years old and I'm a forensic accountant who specializes in finding lies hidden in spreadsheets. It's fitting, really, because I've spent my entire life trying to decode the lies hidden in my own family. That's what brought me back to my late grandmother's house on this cold March afternoon, sorting through her belongings 3 weeks after her funeral, searching for answers she promised I'd find. The house smelled exactly the same: lavender sachets and old books, the scent of the only home I'd ever truly known. I'd been living here since Grandma got sick, taking leave from my job to care for her in her final months. Now she was gone, and the silence felt different. Heavier. More permanent. I stood in her bedroom, running my fingers across the familiar quilt she'd made by hand, and felt 7 years old again. That was how old I was when my parents drove me here and left me. Not because we were poor. My father worked in corporate finance. My mother came from old Washington money. Not because I was in danger or they were unfit. They simply said, "You'll be better off here with Grandma." Loaded my suitcases into their Mercedes, and drove away with my little sister Emma waving from the back window. I never got an explanation. Never got a conversation about why I was being sent away while Emma got to stay in our beautiful house with the wraparound porch and her princess bedroom. It was presented as a done deal, a decision made by adults that a child had no right to question. I remember standing in Grandma's doorway, clutching my stuffed rabbit, watching their tail lights disappear down the tree-lined street, and thinking, what did I do wrong? The memory was triggered by a shoebox I just found in Grandma's closet, labeled Olivia, age 7, in her neat handwriting. Inside were my old school papers, a few drawings, and a diary I'd forgotten existed. I opened it to a random page and saw my child's handwriting. "Mommy didn't call on my birthday. Grandma made me a cake. It was chocolate." I wished Mommy would come back, but she didn't. I had to sit down on the bed, the diary trembling in my hands. I remembered that birthday. My 8th. Grandma had baked the cake from scratch, put 8 candles on it, sang to me with such fierce love in her voice. But I'd spent the whole day watching the phone, waiting for it to ring. It never did. What I didn't write in that diary, what I'd buried so deep I almost forgot, was what happened the week before I was sent away. I was 7, sitting at the kitchen table doing a coloring book while Mom made coffee and Emma played with dolls on the floor. I looked up at my mother, then at my sister, then back at my mother, and asked with pure innocent curiosity, "Mommy, why do I look like Daddy but Emma doesn't?" I can still see my mother's face draining of color, like someone had pulled a plug. Her hand started shaking so badly she had to set down her coffee cup before she dropped it. The ceramic clinked against the granite counter. She turned to me, mouth opening and closing. No words coming out. Then she said in a voice I'd never heard before, tight and cold, "Go to your room, Olivia. Now." I obeyed, confused and scared. That night I crept out of bed because I heard raised voices downstairs. I sat at the top of the stairs, hidden in shadow, and listened to my parents argue in harsh whispers that carried up through the silence. "She's starting to notice," my mother hissed. "I told you this would happen, Diana." She's 7 years old. She doesn't understand. She will. Kids talk, Richard. They compare. We can't risk. So, what do you suggest? We can't just your daughter. Mom interrupted, putting strange emphasis on the words. Your daughter is becoming a problem. I didn't understand what they meant. I just knew that somehow my innocent question had caused something terrible. The next morning my bags were packed. Mom's face was composed, distant. Dad wouldn't meet my eyes. They drove me to Grandma's house an hour outside the city, hugged me quickly and left. I never lived with them again. Oh, they maintained the bare minimum. I visited for major holidays, Christmas, sometimes Thanksgiving. But I was always treated like a distant relative, not a daughter. Emma got the attention, the interest, the affection. I got polite questions and awkward silences. No one ever explained why I'd been sent away. No one ever apologized. It was just accepted as the natural order of things. Emma belonged with them, and I didn't. Grandma never said a bad word about my parents, at least not directly. But I remember her watching my mother during those rare visits. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes sharp and assessing. She'd pull me aside afterward and say things like, "Some people are too afraid to face the truth, sweetheart." Or, "A person's cruelty often has nothing to do with you and everything to do with their own shame." And then just a month before she died, she'd gripped my hand with surprising strength and said, "Not every child is born from truth, Olivia. Remember that. And remember that your worth doesn't come from their approval. It comes from knowing who you are." I thought she was being philosophical, offering comfort in the abstract way dying people sometimes do. But now, surrounded by her belongings, I wondered if she'd been trying to tell me something specific. I set the diary aside and continued sorting through the closet. That's when I found the large manila envelope in the back corner, sealed and labeled in Grandma's handwriting for Olivia. "Open when they come back." My heart started pounding. When they come back? Come back from where? For what? With trembling fingers I broke the seal and pulled out the contents. On top was a letter in Grandma's handwriting, but beneath it I could see photographs, old newspaper clippings, and what looked like legal documents. I set those aside for a moment and focused on the photograph that slipped out first. It was my parents' wedding photo from 1993. I'd seen the official portraits before, the ones that hung in their house, all posed smiles and formal elegance. But this was different. This was a candid shot taken during the ceremony itself. My father stood at the altar in his tuxedo looking at the camera. But my mother, in her white dress and veil, wasn't looking at the camera. She wasn't looking at her groom either. Her eyes were fixed on something beyond the frame, somewhere in the distance, and the expression on her face made my breath catch. It wasn't joy. It wasn't nervousness. It was pure, unmistakable longing mixed with what looked like grief. She looked like a woman saying goodbye to something precious, like someone being led to a beautiful cage she'd never escape. I'd never seen that expression on my mother's face before. Never seen her look vulnerable or conflicted or anything other than coldly controlled. Who was she looking at? What was she longing for? And why had Grandma kept this photograph hidden all these years? I reached for the letter with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, knowing that, whatever I was about to read would change everything I thought I knew about my family. I set the photograph down carefully, my hands still trembling, and reached for Grandma's letter. But before I could unfold it, the image of my mother's face in that wedding photo triggered another memory, one I'd tried to bury for years. Christmas 2018. I was 22, fresh out of Georgetown with my bachelor's degree, and I'd made the mistake of accepting my parents' invitation to come home for the holidays. I should have known better. I arrived on Christmas Eve with a small suitcase and a bottle of wine I'd carefully selected for dinner, naive enough to think this time might be different. My father opened the door with a brief hug and a distracted, "Good to see you," already turning back toward the living room where I could hear Emma's laughter. My mother appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and said, with practiced casualness, "Oh, Olivia, you can take the couch in the den, honey. We didn't prepare the guest room." I stood in the foyer, suitcase in hand, processing those words. The couch? It's very comfortable, Mom assured me, already walking away. Emma's in her suite, of course, and the guest room is my yoga studio now. You don't mind, do you? It's just for a few nights. I minded. Of course I minded. But what was I supposed to say? That I was their daughter and deserved an actual bed, that, after not seeing them for 2 years, the least they could do was clear out some yoga mats. Instead, I smiled tightly and said, "Sure, that's fine." The house had been completely remodeled since I'd lived there as a child. Everything was open concept and modern, gleaming marble countertops, designer furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking their manicured garden. It was beautiful. It was also clearly designed for exactly 3 people. Emma's suite took up the entire east wing of the second-floor bedroom. Bathroom with a soaking tub, walk-in closet, and a small sitting area. I'd glimpsed it briefly when she gave me a tour, her voice bright with pride as she showed off the custom built-ins Dad had commissioned for her 24th birthday. The guest room, my supposed room, in any rational family, had been gutted and transformed into Mom's wellness sanctuary. Complete with bamboo floors, a wall of mirrors, and enough meditation cushions to seat a small yoga class. There was no bed, no dresser, nowhere. A daughter might stay when she visited. The message was architectural. This home had been designed for a family of 3, and I wasn't part of the blueprint. That first evening, while Mom and Emma prepared Christmas dinner and Dad watched football, in his study I walked through the house alone, really looking at it for the first time. Every wall, every shelf, every surface was covered with photographs. I stopped in the hallway, studying the gallery of frames that told the story of their family. Emma as a baby, pink-cheeked and smiling. Emma's first day of kindergarten. Emma at her ballet recital. Emma graduating from high school from college. Emma's engagement party last spring with her fiancé's arm around her waist. The progression was complete, chronological, lovingly curated. Hundreds of moments carefully preserved and displayed. I appeared in exactly 2 photographs. The first was a hospital newborn photo, me red-faced and swaddled with a little pink hat. No parents in the frame, just a standard-issue hospital picture. The second was a formal family portrait from 1999 when I was about 9. We were arranged stiffly in front of a fireplace. Dad standing behind Mom's chair. Mom seated with her hands folded, Emma on her lap, and me standing awkwardly to the side like an afterthought. Even in that single family photo, the composition told the truth. I was peripheral. But it was while studying those photographs that I noticed something I'd never consciously registered before. Emma was my mother's clone. Same delicate bone structure. Same wide-set eyes with that slight upturn at the corners. Same heart-shaped face and full lips. Looking at photos of young Emma was like looking at childhood pictures of Diana. The resemblance was almost eerie in its completeness. I, on the other hand, looked nothing like my mother. Nothing. I had my father's strong jawline, his straight nose, his deep-set eyes even. His coloring, that combination of dark hair and fair skin that tanned easily. Standing in that hallway looking at the visual evidence arranged chronologically on the walls, the genetics told a clear story. Emma was Diana's daughter in every visible way. I was Richard's. At the time, I just thought it was one of those quirks of heredity. Some children favor one parent. But now, holding that wedding photograph with my mother's longing gaze fixed on something beyond the frame, I wondered if the genetics told a more complicated truth. That night, I'd lain on the den couch, under a thin throw blanket trying to sleep, while the leather cushions creaked under me every time I shifted position. The house was quiet, everyone supposedly in bed when I heard voices from the kitchen, my parents arguing and harsh whispers that carried through the silence. I can't do this anymore. My mother's voice was sharp with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Every time I see her, I'm reminded of Diana. My father's tone was warning, cutting her off. She's still my daughter. You can't keep a door slammed. The argument ended abruptly. I lay frozen on that couch, heart pounding, replaying those words. Every time I see her, I'm reminded of what did I remind her of? And why had Dad said my daughter with such emphasis, as if he needed to assert my relationship to him specifically? I'd left the day after Christmas making up an excuse about work commitments. None of them seemed particularly disappointed to see me go. Now 6 years later, standing in Grandma's bedroom with that wedding photo in my hands, I finally understood that I'd been hearing puzzle pieces my whole life without recognizing the pattern. The physical resemblances, the arguments, the way Mom couldn't look at me without something flickering across her face. Something I'd always interpreted as disappointment, but might have been something else entirely. I set the photo aside and continued sorting through the closet, working methodically through boxes of Grandma's papers. That's when I found her diary, a simple leather-bound journal she'd kept sporadically over the years. I flipped through pages of grocery lists and gardening notes, until an entry from 2010 stopped me cold. The handwriting was shakier than usual, suggesting Grandma had been upset when she wrote it. Watch Diana today at Olivia's school concert. The child doesn't know her family came and left early. Dee's face when she looks at that girl, it's not dislike. It's fear. What is she so afraid Olivia will discover? Fear. Not dislike, not disappointment, not mere favoritism. Fear. What secret could be so terrible that my mother had spent my entire life afraid I'd discover it? I stared at those words until they blurred. What is she so afraid Olivia will discover? The question hung in the air of Grandma's quiet bedroom, unanswered, but heavy with implication. And suddenly, I was back in May 2018, 4 months before that Christmas visit, standing in my dorm room at Georgetown University, with a cream-colored graduation invitation in my hands. I'd ordered the invitations myself, paid for them with money from my part-time job at the campus library. The university provided standard announcements, but I wanted something nicer, something that reflected what this achievement meant to me. 4 years of working 2 jobs while maintaining a perfect GPA. 4 years of scholarships and financial aid applications because my parents made it clear they wouldn't contribute to my education. 4 years of proving I was worth something, even if my family didn't think so. I wrote the invitation to my parents by hand, my penmanship careful and neat. Inside, I tucked a small note card. It would mean everything if you came. Love, Olivia. I mailed it 3 months in advance, giving them plenty of time to clear their schedules. Then I waited. Weeks passed. No response, no phone call, no text message, not even a brief email acknowledging they'd received it. Finally, 2 weeks before graduation, I broke down and called my father's cell phone. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice distracted clearly in the middle of something else. "Hi, Dad. It's Olivia. I was just wondering if you got my graduation invitation." There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling. "Oh yes. Right. Georgetown, isn't it?" My throat tightened. I'd been going to Georgetown for 4 years. He knew this. "Yes, the ceremony is May 19th at 2 p.m. I included all the details in the invitation. I was hoping you and Mom could come." Another pause. Then his voice came through flat and utterly disinterested. "Olivia, don't make such a big deal of it. It's just a degree. Thousands of people graduate every year." I stood there in my dorm room holding the phone, feeling something crack inside my chest. Not breaking would have been cleaner, more complete. This was a slow fracture, the kind that spreads in hairline patterns through glass. "I'm graduating summa cum laude," I said quietly, "with highest honors. And I have a job lined up at Deloitte starting in August." "That's nice, sweetheart." His tone suggested he was already thinking about whatever meeting or golf game I'd interrupted. "Listen, your mother and I will send a gift card or something. You understand we can't always make every little event." Every little event. My college graduation was a little event. Right. I managed. "Of course, thanks anyway." I hung up before he could hear my voice break. I didn't cry. I'd learned a long time ago that crying over my parents' indifference was like crying over the weather. It didn't change anything. It just made you feel worse. Graduation day was exactly as beautiful, and exactly as painful as I'd anticipated. The weather was perfect, sunny and warm, with a light breeze that kept the ceremony from feeling stifling in our caps and gowns. I sat in my assigned seat among my fellow graduates, listening to speeches about bright futures and limitless potential, and tried not to keep checking the audience. When they called my name, Olivia Marie Carter, Bachelor of Science in Accounting, summa cum laude, I walked across that stage with my head high. I accepted my diploma, shook hands with the dean, smiled for the photographer, and I scanned the crowd knowing it was futile but unable to stop myself from hoping that maybe, just maybe, they'd surprise me. That maybe they were sitting in the back or running late, or that Dad's dismissal on the phone had been some kind of test. They weren't there. But Grandma was. Front row, exactly where I'd told her to sit, wearing her best dress and a corsage I'd sent her. When she saw me looking, she stood up and clapped, tears streaming down her wrinkled face, her expression radiating pure pride. The 2 seats beside her, the ones I'd reserved, and paid the extra fee for the ones I'd marked, with little cards that said reserved for Carter family, remained conspicuously empty. After the ceremony, I found Grandma in the crowd. She pulled me into a fierce hug, not caring that my cap fell off. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "So incredibly proud." Around us, other families were celebrating. Parents snapping photos, siblings holding bouquets, grandparents beaming. I watched a girl I barely knew get lifted off her feet by her father while her mother dabbed at happy tears. The contrast was almost unbearable. Grandma saw me watching. She squeezed my hand and said gently, "How about we skip the crowd and go somewhere quiet for lunch? Just us." We went to a small diner off campus, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that came in heavy ceramic mugs. Grandma ordered us both pie even though it was only 3 in the afternoon. As I picked up my slice of cherry pie, trying to pretend I was fine, she reached across the table and took my hand. "Their absence says everything about them and nothing about you," she said firmly. "Do you hear me, Olivia? You earned that degree through your own brilliance and determination. You don't need their validation to make it real." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. That evening, alone in my dorm room, while my roommate was out celebrating with her family, I made the mistake of checking Instagram. Emma had posted a photo carousel. The first image showed our parents' garden in full bloom, the one Mom had spent thousands of dollars landscaping. The second showed a table set for an elaborate outdoor lunch, crystal glasses catching the sunlight. The third showed Mom and Dad dressed in expensive casual wear, laughing, with a group of friends I vaguely recognized from their social circle. Everyone held champagne flutes. Everyone looked perfectly happy. The caption read, "Lazy Sunday Perfection," followed by a flower emoji. The timestamp showed it had been posted at 2:47 p.m., right in the middle of my graduation ceremony. I took a screenshot. I don't know why, maybe I needed proof that I wasn't crazy, that this was really happening. Then I closed the app and lay on my bed staring at the ceiling. 3 days later my father called. I almost didn't answer, but some stubborn part of me wanted to hear what he'd say. "Olivia, hi. Did you receive the gift card we sent? Not congratulations. Not sorry, we missed your graduation. Just a question about whether I'd received something I hadn't actually received." "No," I said, my voice remarkably calm. "But that's okay. I got exactly what I expected from you. Thank you for the clarity." I hung up before he could respond. It felt good, that small act of defiance. Not healing, but good. 2 days after that conversation, my phone rang at 6 in the morning. It was a number I didn't recognize, a local area code from Grandma's town. My heart started pounding before I even answered. "Is this Olivia Carter?" A woman's voice, professional and gentle. "This is County General Hospital. Your grandmother was brought in by ambulance about an hour ago. She collapsed in her garden. You're listed as her emergency contact." I was in my car within 10 minutes, still in pajama pants and a sweatshirt, driving the hour to the hospital with my hand shaking on the wheel. When I reached her room, she was sitting up in bed looking small and frail in a way I'd never seen before. The doctor had just left. The words, "Stage 4 pancreatic cancer," and "weeks, maybe a month," were still echoing in my head. Grandma saw my face and reached for my hand. Her grip was weaker than it should have been. "There's an envelope in my safe," she said, her voice urgent, despite her exhaustion. "The combination is your birthday. The real numbers, not the ones I told everyone else. Don't open it until they come back." "Who?" I asked, though I already knew. "Who's coming back?" "Your parents," she said, squeezing my hand with surprising strength. "They will come back, Olivia. When I'm gone, they'll come for what they think they're owed. And when they do, you'll need what's in that envelope. Promise me you won't open it until then." I promised, not understanding but trusting her completely. She smiled faintly and closed her eyes. "They will come back," she repeated almost to herself. "And when they do, you'll finally understand everything." Grandma lived for 3 more weeks after that hospital visit. I took a leave of absence from my job at Deloitte and moved into her house, sleeping in the guest room that had always been mine, caring for her as she'd once cared for me. We didn't talk much about the envelope or her cryptic warnings. Instead, we talked about everything else: her childhood, her marriage to my grandfather, who died before I was born, her garden, her friends. She told me stories I'd never heard before, as if she was trying to give me a complete picture of who she was before she disappeared. On a gray March afternoon with rain tapping against the windows, she squeezed my hand and whispered, "The envelope is your shield, sweetheart. Mr. Chen's number is inside. He's already paid through 2026. Find Marcus Blake. Test your blood, not just with your father, with Emma too. Promise me." "I promise," I said, though I didn't understand. "But, Grandma, who is Marcus Blake? What does my blood have to do with—" "Promise me," she insisted, her grip surprisingly strong. "Test it. Compare it. You'll understand when you see the results." Those were her last coherent words. She slipped into unconsciousness an hour later and passed peacefully just before midnight, her hand still in mine. I sat with her body for a long time, crying in a way I hadn't let myself cry since I was 7 years old. Mourning not just her death, but the realization that she'd been the only person who'd ever truly loved me. I called my parents the next morning to tell them she died. My father answered, his tone shifting from annoyed at the early call to appropriately somber when he heard the news. "I see. Well, that's unfortunate. When's the funeral?" No condolences for my loss. No acknowledgement that I'd been the one caring for her, the one holding her hand as she died. Just logistics. The funeral was 3 days later at the small church Grandma had attended for 40 years. The turnout was modest. Her elderly friends, a few neighbors, the pastor who'd known her since the 1980s. My parents arrived precisely on time, dressed impeccably. Mom wore a black designer dress that probably cost more than Grandma's monthly Social Security check. Her makeup perfect, a black hat, adding a theatrical touch of mourning. She dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief during the service, though I never saw actual tears. Dad stood beside her, rigid and uncomfortable in his dark suit, checking his watch twice during the eulogy. I noticed he didn't sing during the hymns, didn't bow his head during the prayers. He was there out of obligation, nothing more. What surprised me was Emma. She sat in the pew next to Mom, and when the pastor talked about Grandma's kindness and generosity, Emma actually cried, real tears streaming down her face as she clutched a tissue. I'd assumed Emma barely remembered Grandma had maybe visited the house once or twice as a child. But watching her genuine grief, I realized she must have had some connection. I didn't know about some memories of kindness during visits I hadn't witnessed. After the burial, people came back to Grandma's house for the reception. Mom and Dad stayed for exactly 30 minutes, made small talk with the neighbors, and left without saying goodbye to me. Emma lingered a bit longer, helping me arrange food in the kitchen with an awkwardness that suggested she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Eventually she just hugged me briefly and whispered, "I'm sorry for your loss." Before following our parents out, the will reading was scheduled for the following week at the office of Grandma's attorney. A stern woman named Patricia Harrow, who looked to be in her mid-60s with steel gray hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every possible family drama. My parents and Emma sat on one side of the conference table. I sat on the other, feeling like we were opposing teams rather than a family. Patricia read through the will in a measured, professional tone. The house valued at $480,000 went to me. The savings account containing $350,000 went to me. Various personal items, jewelry, furniture, photo albums, all to me. Everything, in fact, went to me. I watched my mother's face tighten with each bequest. My father's expression remained neutral, but I saw his jaw clench. Emma just looked down at her hands. Then Patricia reached a particular clause, and her tone sharpened slightly as if she'd been waiting for this moment. I, Helen Carter, include this provision to protect my granddaughter. Any attempt by the Carter family to contest this will pressure Olivia Carter into sharing inheritance, or manipulate her in any manner will result in a $50,000 donation being made in their names to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, with a public statement explaining the donation is being made due to their own. The silence in the room was absolute. Mom's face went white, then red. Dad shifted in his seat. Emma looked genuinely shocked. Patricia looked up from the document, her eyes moving deliberately to each of them. "Your mother was very thorough, Miss Carter. She anticipated this moment and took steps to protect you. Are there any questions?" There were no questions. The meeting ended shortly after. My parents left without a word to me. Emma paused at the door, opened her mouth as if to say something, then thought better of it and followed them out. That night, I sat alone in Grandma's house, my house now, and retrieved the envelope from her safe. The combination was my real birthday, 041,696. Inside, I found exactly what she described during her final days, though. Seeing it was different from hearing about it. The first item was a photograph, the colors slightly faded with age. It showed a young version of my mother, maybe 25 years old, standing in what looked like an art gallery. She was beautiful in a way I'd never seen before. Her smile genuine and unguarded, her body leaning into the man beside her. He had his arm around her waist, and they were looking at each other instead of the camera, caught in a moment of obvious intimacy. The man was tall, dark-haired, with an artist's casual style, paint-stained jeans, and a worn button-down shirt. He was definitely not my father. The second item was a newspaper clipping from 1994, yellowed and carefully preserved. "Local artist Marcus Blake featured in Emerging Talents exhibition," read the headline. Below was a photo of the same man from the gallery picture standing next to one of his paintings. The third item was a letter in Grandma's familiar handwriting, several pages long. I read it slowly, my hands trembling. She explained that she had no concrete proof, only 3 decades of careful observation, and a growing certainty that Diana was hiding something fundamental about our family. She described watching Diana's face whenever she looked at me, noting that it wasn't mere dislike, but something closer to fear or guilt. She mentioned conversations she'd overheard, patterns she'd noticed, pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite complete, but knew were significant. The letter concluded, "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and they've come back for what they think they're owed. Don't give them anything until you know the truth. Blood doesn't always mean what we think it means. Mr. Chen can help you find Marcus Blake. Test your DNA, Olivia. Test it against your father's, and test it against Damas. The truth is in your blood." The final item was a business card, James Chen, private investigator, with a phone number and an email address. On the back, in Grandma's handwriting, "Retainer paid through December 2026. He knows what to look for." I sat with these items spread across Grandma's kitchen table, trying to piece together what she was telling me. Marcus Blake, my mother's obvious intimacy with him in that photo. The date 1993, the year before Emma was born. Test your blood against Emma's. The implication was impossible, wasn't it? 3 days later, my phone rang. I'd been sitting in Grandma's garden trying to decide whether to call Mr. Chen or whether I was ready for whatever truth he might uncover. The caller ID showed Diana Carter Mom. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. Hello? My mother's voice came through, and it was nothing like I'd ever heard from her before. Warm, concerned, almost affectionate. Sweetheart, I know things have been difficult between us over the years. I know I haven't been the mother you deserved, but I think it's time we talked, really talked. Can we meet maybe for lunch this week? I stared at the photograph of her with Marcus Blake at the newspaper clipping, at Grandma's warning not to give them anything until I knew the truth. Why now? I asked carefully. Because life is short, Olivia. Because your grandmother's death reminded me that we shouldn't waste time on old grudges. Because you're my daughter, and I'd like to try to fix what's been broken. She'd never called me her daughter before. Not like that, not with that tone. They've come back. Grandma had warned, and when they do, you'll need what's in that envelope. Okay, I said slowly. Let's meet. I chose the restaurant carefully. The Meridian was upscale enough to meet my parents' standards, but public enough to keep things civil. More importantly, I'd used it twice before for client meetings with my accounting firm, which meant I could legitimately record our conversation as a business dinner under DC's one-party consent laws. I arrived early, set my phone to voice memo mode, and tucked it into my purse positioned on the table. By the time my family walked through the door, I was calm, prepared, and quietly furious. Mom spotted me first and broke into a smile I'd never seen directed at me before. She glided across the restaurant in a cream-colored designer suit, arms outstretched, as if we were close relatives reuniting after too long apart. Olivia, sweetheart, she said, pulling me into a brief hug that smelled of expensive perfume. Dad followed behind her, offering a firm handshake and a, good to see you, honey, that sounded almost natural. Emma trailed slightly behind them, her expression uncomfortable, as if she wasn't quite sure what role she was supposed to play in this performance. The first 20 minutes were pure theater. Mom ordered a bottle of Chardonnay, poured glasses for everyone, and raised hers in a toast. To Helen, she said, her voice catching slightly. She was a remarkable woman. We're going to miss her terribly. I lifted my glass without drinking. She would have appreciated you coming to her funeral. Mom had the grace to look momentarily abashed. I know we haven't always been as present as we should have been. That's actually part of why I wanted us to get together. Life is so short, Olivia. Your grandmother's passing reminded us that we shouldn't waste time on old grudges or hurt feelings. Family needs to stick together, especially during grief. Dad nodded along, playing the role of concerned father with surprising commitment. Your mother's right. We've let too much time pass without really connecting. We'd like to change that. How's your work going? Mom asked, leaning forward with what appeared to be genuine interest. You're at Deloitte, aren't you? That must be fascinating work. It was the most she'd asked about my career in a decade. I answered carefully, watching her face looking for cracks in the performance. She asked follow-up questions. She made eye contact. She touched my hand when I mentioned a difficult audit case, her fingers warm and seemingly sympathetic. If I hadn't spent my entire childhood watching her ignore me, I might have believed she actually cared. Emma contributed occasionally, her comments polite, but strained. Olivia's always been so smart with numbers, she said at one point, though it sounded like she was reading from a script. Remember, Mom, how she used to help you balance the checkbook when she was little? I didn't remember that because it had never happened, but I smiled and let it pass. The appetizers arrived. We made small talk about the restaurant, the weather, Emma's recent promotion at her marketing firm. Then Dad set down his wineglass and shifted his posture, slightly becoming more businesslike. He reached into the leather briefcase he'd brought and pulled out a portfolio embossed with gold lettering, the Carter Family Foundation. Olivia, your mother and I have been doing a lot of thinking since Helen passed, he began. She was such a generous woman, always thinking about others. We want to honor her memory in a meaningful way. He slid the portfolio across the table. I opened it to find professionally printed documents, articles of incorporation, a mission statement, a projected budget, organizational charts. The foundation's stated purpose was to support underprivileged children. From broken homes, providing scholarships and mentoring programs. The mission statement was beautifully written, full of touching language about giving children the opportunities they deserve. We want you on the board of directors, Mom said, her voice warm and inclusive. This could be Helen's real legacy. She always cared so much about children who needed support, children like you were. The phrasing was deliberate, children like you were. As if I'd been saved from some terrible fate. As if I should be grateful and therefore obligated. We're seeking seed funding from family members, Dad continued. We thought a contribution of $250,000 from your inheritance would be appropriate. It would show real commitment to the cause. I paged through the document slowly, my forensic accountant's brain automatically flagging irregularities. Emma was listed as executive director with a salary of $120,000 annually. For someone with a bachelor's degree in communications and no nonprofit experience, that was excessive. Administrative costs were projected at 40% of the total budget, which was absurdly high for a legitimate charity. Diana's college roommate, someone named Margaret Holloway, was listed as the financial consultant at $8,000 per month. The structure wasn't technically illegal, but it was designed to funnel money to family members and their friends under the nonprofit umbrella. They'd created a vehicle to pay themselves using my inheritance while getting the tax benefits and social capital of running a charity. This is very thorough, I said neutrally. When did you put this together? We filed the preliminary paperwork last week, Dad said. Right after the funeral, we wanted to move quickly while the inspiration was fresh. Last week, they'd started this process before the will was even read, before they knew for certain what I'd inherit, which meant they'd been planning this the moment they learned Grandma was dying. I'll need some time to review this with my financial advisor, I said, closing the portfolio. 2 weeks should be sufficient. Mom's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, sweetheart. We understand you want to be careful, but we're hoping to launch the foundation publicly next month, so we'd appreciate your answer sooner rather than later. 2 weeks, I repeated firmly. Emma, who'd been mostly silent during the pitch, leaned toward me as we were gathering our things to leave. Her voice was low and sharp, with an edge I'd heard before at that Christmas dinner years ago. You've always been selfish, Olivia. Always thinking about yourself instead of the family. This is a chance to finally be part of something bigger than yourself, to actually contribute instead of just taking. I stared at her, genuinely stunned. I'd taken nothing from this family except rejection. But before I could respond, Mom placed a hand on Emma's arm in warning, and the moment passed. We parted in the parking lot with promises to talk soon. I sat in my car for 5 minutes after they drove away, hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. Then I made 2 phone calls. The first was to the number on Mr. Chen's business card. He answered on the second ring with a calm, professional voice. Miss Carter, I've been expecting your call. Your grandmother briefed me extensively before she passed. I assume you found the material she left for you. I have. Can we meet tomorrow? I'll email you my office address. 10 a.m. work for you? The second call was to my personal attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Reeves, who'd handled my employment contract when I started at Deloitte. Patricia, I needed advice on nonprofit structures and potential fraud indicators. Can you review some documents? Of course. How urgent? Very. I drove home to Grandma's house and spent the next several hours researching foundation fraud cases, taking notes and documenting every red flag in my parents' proposal. Around 2 in the morning, exhausted and running on coffee, I checked my phone and found 3 text notifications from former colleagues. The first one read, "Saw your mom's post about the foundation. That's so wonderful. Helen would be so proud." My stomach dropped. I opened Facebook on my laptop. There, posted 3 hours earlier on Diana Carter's timeline, was a carefully curated album titled Family Legacy: The Carter Foundation. The photos showed our dinner at the Meridian. In them, I looked engaged, interested, almost happy. Mom had captured the moment when I was examining the foundation documents, my expression focused and professional. The caption read, "Beautiful evening with our daughter Olivia as we plan the Carter Family Foundation in my mother-in-law Helen's memory. So grateful to be building this together as a family. Helen dedicated her life to helping children in need, and we're honored to continue her work. More details coming soon." The post already had over 200 likes. Friends and acquaintances commented, "What a wonderful tribute. Helen would be so touched. Your family is truly inspiring." They were creating a public narrative before I'd agreed to anything. If I backed out now, I'd look like the selfish daughter who'd refused to honor her grandmother's memory. They'd positioned me perfectly. I stared at that post until the screen blurred and I realized with absolute clarity, this wasn't about reconciliation or family healing. This was about money. It had always been about money. And whatever secret Grandma had suspected, whatever truth was hidden in Marcus Blake's identity and my blood, it was tied to this somehow. It had to be. I pulled out the photograph of my mother with Marcus Blake studying her genuine smile and wondered what she was so desperate to keep hidden that she'd orchestrate this elaborate performance. Tomorrow I'd find out. Sitting at Grandma's kitchen table at 2 in the morning, staring at Diana's carefully orchestrated Facebook post, I realized my mother had made a crucial miscalculation. She was treating me like the uncertain 7-year-old she'd sent away, not the woman I'd become. She didn't know what I did for a living beyond the vague title, accountant. She had no idea that the skills I'd spent 6 years developing were exactly the skills needed to unravel the kind of scheme she was running. My career path had been deliberate and methodical, built from nothing because I'd had no family connections to leverage. After Georgetown, I joined Deloitte's Forensic Accounting Division in the Washington, D.C. office. The work appealed to me immediately, not just because I was good with numbers, but because forensic accounting was essentially detective work. My job was to find lies hidden in financial statements, to follow money trails that people thought they erased, to spot patterns that revealed embezzlement, money laundering, tax fraud, and corporate deception. I discovered I had a talent for it. Maybe it was all those years of watching my family trying to decode their behavior, searching for clues about why I wasn't wanted. Childhood had trained me to observe what people hide, to read subtext and casual remarks, to trust documentation over reassurances. When someone told me their books were clean while their eyes shifted away, I knew where to look. When a client insisted their transactions were legitimate while their hands fidgeted with paperwork, I knew which accounts to audit first. Over 6 years, I worked my way up from junior associate to senior consultant. I handled cases for Fortune 500 companies, investigating internal theft for law firms, building cases against corrupt executives for government agencies, tracking financial crimes. Every case required absolute confidentiality, protected by ironclad NDAs. I couldn't tell friends what I was working on, couldn't post about my achievements on social media, couldn't even mention my clients' names. By 2023, I was earning $180,000 a year, living modestly in a small apartment, and banking most of my salary because I'd learned early that security comes from what you save, not what you spend. I had no social media presence beyond a bare-bones LinkedIn profile required for professional networking. My Facebook account hadn't been updated since college. I was essentially invisible online, which was exactly how I wanted it. My parents knew I worked in accounting. They didn't know I'd become an expert in uncovering exactly the kind of financial manipulation they were now attempting. In February 2024, just weeks before Grandma's collapse, I received an unexpected email from a government defense contractor I'd worked with on a previous classified audit. They were launching a new division focused on AI ethics and military applications, and needed someone with both technical accounting skills and top-secret security clearance to serve as lead AI ethics auditor. The role involved reviewing AI development contracts, ensuring ethical compliance in weapons systems applications, and auditing financial flows in classified programs. The compensation package was staggering $2.5 million over 3 years, which broke down to roughly $833,000 annually when you included base salary, stock options, and performance bonuses. It was more money than I'd imagined earning at 34. The position required the highest level of security clearance, which I'd obtained 2 years earlier for previous defense work, and the job wouldn't start until May. To allow time for final clearance verification and transition from my current role, I signed the contract in early March, a week before Grandma collapsed. I'd been planning to tell her the good news the next time I visited, imagining her proud smile the way she'd insist on taking me to dinner to celebrate. But I never got the chance. By the time the paperwork was finalized, she was in the hospital, and then she was gone, and my career success felt hollow without her there to share it. The position was supposed to remain relatively quiet. The work was classified, the clients were government agencies, and I assumed it would simply be another confidential role on my resume. But in April, a few weeks after Grandma's funeral, the contractor's public relations department made a decision without consulting me. They published a team announcement in the National Defense Industry Journal, a professional trade publication read primarily by people in the defense and government sectors. The article was titled, "Leading Defense Contractor Expands AI Ethics Division with Top Talent Acquisition," and included a brief paragraph about me. Olivia Carter, former senior forensic accountant at Deloitte, with extensive experience in classified government audits, joins as lead AI ethics auditor. Ms. Carter brings expertise in financial oversight and compliance to ensure ethical standards in emerging military AI applications. It wasn't classified information. The article carefully avoided any specifics about actual projects or clients. It was meant to build the contractor's credibility, showing they were hiring qualified people for sensitive work. I didn't think much of it at first. It was a trade publication, not the Washington Post. My parents didn't read defense industry journals, but I'd forgotten about LinkedIn. Within days of the article's publication, several colleagues and former classmates shared it on their professional profiles, congratulating me on the new position. The post made it searchable, visible, part of the public professional network that people browse when they're curious about someone's career. Diana must have been searching for me. Maybe she did it regularly, checking to see what I was up to, or maybe she started after the will reading when she realized I'd inherited everything. However, she found it. I was working from Grandma's house 3 days after that restaurant meeting, reviewing the foundation documents more carefully, and documenting every irregularity when my phone rang. Diana's name appeared on the screen. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out. Hello? Her voice practically bubbled with enthusiasm, a warmth I'd never heard directed at me before. Olivia, sweetheart, I just saw the news about your incredible new position. Lead AI Ethics Auditor for Defense Applications. My goodness, that's extraordinary. We're so proud of you. We, as if she had any right to claim pride in accomplishments she'd never supported, had never even acknowledged until they became useful to her. I was actually calling to follow up on our dinner conversation, she continued, not waiting for me to respond to her congratulations. I've been thinking about the foundation, and this news about your new role makes it even more perfect. Your expertise, your success, your credibility in the government sector. This is exactly what we need on our board. You'd bring such legitimacy to the foundation. When can we meet again to finalize the details? I'd love to move forward quickly so we can include your name in our official launch materials. There it was. The real reason for the sudden enthusiasm. Not pride in my achievement, but recognition of how my credentials could be exploited for their foundation's credibility. A lead auditor for classified defense work on their board would open doors, attract donors, make their scheme look legitimate. I leaned back in Grandma's kitchen chair, looking at the Marcus Blake photograph still sitting on the table beside the foundation documents. Actually, Mom, I'm still reviewing the proposal with my advisors, I said carefully. I'll need at least 2 weeks before I can make any commitments. My new position requires careful consideration of any outside board memberships. The pause was brief but telling. When she spoke again, the warmth had cooled slightly. Of course, darling. We understand. But don't take too long. We'd hate for you to miss the opportunity to be part of Helen's legacy. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet house and realized the game had changed. They weren't just after my inheritance anymore. They wanted my professional reputation as a shield for their fraud, and they had no idea I'd spent 6 years learning exactly how to dismantle people like them. I spent the next 2 weeks doing exactly what I'd told Diana I would do, reviewing their proposal with advisors. The first advisor was myself, applying every forensic technique I'd learned to scrutinize the foundation's structure. The second was Mr. Chen, who I'd met briefly at his office to discuss Marcus Blake and my family's background, though he'd asked for time to compile his findings. The third was Patricia Reeves, my attorney, who'd taken one look at the foundation documents and said, "This isn't illegal, but it's ethically dubious. Be very careful." When Diana called to schedule the follow-up meeting, I expected another restaurant. Instead, she suggested their home. It's more comfortable, more private. We can really talk. I'll make lunch. The invitation felt significant somehow, like being welcomed into the family home was supposed to signal acceptance inclusion. I agreed, partly because I was curious to see the house again, partly because I wanted to observe them in their own environment, where they'd feel most in control. I arrived on a warm Saturday in May, to find the house had been renovated again since my last visit 6 years ago. The exterior had been repainted in a soft gray with white trim, the landscaping professionally designed with native plants, and a stone pathway leading to the front door. Inside, everything was tasteful and expensive hardwood floors that gleamed, custom millwork artwork that was clearly original rather than prints. This level of renovation and decoration didn't come cheap. I found myself mentally calculating the cost, wondering where the money had come from, given that Dad was supposedly just a senior VP at his firm. Diana greeted me with a warm hug and led me on a tour, pointing out the new kitchen with marble countertops and professional grade appliances, the renovated living room with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the garden. "We did all this last year," she said proudly. "Richard finally got his promotion, and we decided to invest in making this house exactly what we wanted." As we climbed the stairs to the second floor, she showed me Emma's suite. The door stood open like a display in a museum. The room was exactly as I remembered from that Christmas visit. The same furniture, the same soft pink bedding, even the same photographs on the dresser. "We kept Emma's room just as she likes it," Diana said, "for when she visits." We passed my old childhood room. The door was cracked, and through the gap I glimpsed cardboard boxes stacked against the wall, plastic storage bins, a rack of Diana's off-season clothes. My room had become a walk-in closet and storage space. Diana didn't mention, it didn't seem to notice I'd seen it. Or maybe she did notice and didn't care. Lunch was served on the terrace overlooking their garden, a beautifully set table with cloth napkins and fresh flowers, an elaborate spread of salads and grilled chicken and homemade bread. Diana played the gracious hostess with practiced ease, pouring iced tea and asking about my new job, my life, my plans. Emma contributed polite small talk. Dad nodded along, adding occasional comments about the weather and the garden. We circled the foundation topic for nearly an hour before Richard finally sat down his napkin and asked directly, "Have you had time to review our proposal, Olivia?" I'd prepared for this. I pulled out a folder from my bag containing my notes and laid it on the table between us. "I have, and I have some concerns I'd like to discuss." Diana smiled tight and slightly, but she nodded. "Of course, sweetheart. We want you to feel completely comfortable." I went through my list methodically, professionally, the way I would present findings to a client. The administrative cost ratio is projected at 40%, which is significantly higher than standard nonprofit best practices. The recommended range is 15 to 25%. I'd like to understand the justification for this allocation. I paused, watching their faces. Additionally, Emma's salary as executive director is $120,000 annually. For someone with a bachelor's degree in communications and no prior nonprofit management experience, this seems excessive compared to industry standards for organizations of this size. Emma's face flushed. Diana's expression hardened, but before either could respond, I continued. "I'm also concerned about the lack of independent board oversight. Currently, all board members are family or close family friends. This creates potential conflicts of interest and reduces accountability." Diana's mask slipped for just a moment, her voice sharp. "Are you implying we're trying to steal from you, Olivia? Is that what you think of your own family?" Richard placed a hand on her arm, his intervention smooth and practiced. "Of course not, Diana. Olivia is just being thorough. That's what makes her so successful in her field. These are legitimate questions." He turned to me, his expression reasonable and accommodating. "You're absolutely right to raise these concerns. What if we reduced administrative costs to 30% and we could add an outside board member, maybe someone from the local nonprofit community who has relevant experience? Would that address your concerns about oversight?" The concessions sounded reasonable, more than reasonable. I felt the pressure to reciprocate, to show I was willing to compromise too. "What about annual audits?" "Absolutely," Richard agreed immediately. "We'll commit to annual independent audits, full transparency." I studied the documents again, my forensic instincts screaming that something was still wrong even though I couldn't point to a specific smoking gun. Finally, I made a decision that I knew even as I made it might be a mistake. I'll contribute $250,000 but in stages. $100,000 now to show good faith and get the foundation operational. $75,000 after 6 months contingent on seeing positive results and clean quarterly financial reports. Another $75,000 after 1 year, again contingent on demonstrated success. I watched their reactions carefully. They should have hesitated, should have asked for more upfront, should have pushed back on the contingencies. Instead, they agreed almost immediately. "That sounds very fair," Diana said, her warmth returning. "We appreciate your careful approach. And of course you'll maintain your board seat with full voting rights on any expenditures over $10,000, Richard added. "We want your input and oversight." Too easy. They'd agreed too quickly to conditions that would significantly limit their flexibility, which meant either they were genuinely committed to running a legitimate foundation, or they were confident they could work around my oversight. Given everything I knew about my family's history with me, I didn't believe option 1. After lunch, I excused myself to use the restroom. On my way back through the house, I passed Richard's study. The door was ajar, and I heard voices inside, Emma and Diana in heated, whispered conversation. I slowed my steps, staying just out of sight. "Just 6 months," Emma was saying, her voice tight with frustration. "She's already trying to control everything." "Keep your voice down." Diana's tone was sharp. "She'll never notice if we're careful. The first 100,000 gives us room to operate, and by the time she asks for the 6-month report," "But she already agreed to the audit," Emma interrupted. "What more does she want?" "It doesn't matter what she wants," Diana said coldly. "We just need to manage her expectations until—" I cleared my throat loudly and stepped into view. The conversation cut off abruptly. Diana emerged from the study with a bright smile. "All set. We're so glad we could work this out, Olivia. Helen would be so proud." I drove home with my hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly, replaying those whispered fragments. "She'll never notice if we're careful. Manage her expectations." They weren't planning to run a legitimate foundation. They were planning to manage me just long enough to access my money. And they assumed I'd be too trusting or too stupid to catch them. I'd made a terrible mistake agreeing to give them anything at all. I pulled over into a parking lot and called Mr. Chen directly. He answered on the first ring. Mr. Chen? I need to accelerate our timeline. Start a full background investigation on Diana Richard and Emma Carter. I need to know everything: financial history, legal issues, business associations, debts, everything. And find out who Marcus Blake is, and why my grandmother wanted me to find him. She said to test my blood against my father's and Emma's. I need to understand why. There was a pause. When Chen spoke, his voice was measured and unsurprised. I've been waiting for you to ask Miss Carter. Your grandmother suspected your family was hiding something significant. I'll have preliminary findings for you in 2 weeks. But I should tell you, when you start pulling threads in families like yours, sometimes the whole fabric unravels. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Emma's room preserved like a shrine and mine converted to storage. I thought about Diana's cold voice, saying she'll never notice if we're careful. I thought about Grandma's warning that blood doesn't always mean what we think it means. Yes, I said. I'm prepared. Find the truth, whatever it is. 2 weeks later, I transferred the first $100,000 to the Carter Family Foundation's business account. I did it from my laptop and Grandma's kitchen, triple-checking the routing numbers, taking screenshots of every confirmation screen, saving PDFs of the wire transfer authorization and receipt. I'd learned from years of forensic work that the documentation you gather at the beginning of a transaction is often the documentation that saves you at the end. The Foundation's response was impressively professional. Within 3 days, I received a FedEx package containing what they called a welcome packet. Inside was a certificate printed on heavy cardstock declaring me an official board member of the Foundation, letterhead with my name listed alongside Diana Richard and Emma as founding directors, and a glossy press release announcing the Foundation's launch. The press release was beautifully written, full of touching language about Helen Carter's legacy of supporting vulnerable children, and the family's commitment to continuing her work. It hadn't been published yet, marked as draft for review, but seeing my name attached to such heartfelt language about my grandmother made me feel complicit in something I didn't quite understand yet. Everything looked legitimate. The Foundation had an employer identification number registered with the IRS. The bank account was properly established under the Foundation's legal name. The letterhead featured a professional logo, a stylized tree with spreading branches, symbolizing growth and support. They'd clearly hired someone competent to handle the branding and legal setup, which made the operation more believable and therefore more dangerous. 2 weeks after my initial transfer, I received a formal invitation to the Foundation launch event scheduled for mid-August at a boutique hotel in downtown DC. The invitation listed a keynote speaker from a local nonprofit coalition, a reception with potential donors, and the announcement of the Foundation's first grant programs. It was real enough to be believable, professional enough to attract legitimate interest, and deceptive enough to hide whatever they were actually doing with my money. In July, I exercised my board rights and sent a formal email requesting the first monthly financial report. I'd specified in our agreement that I wanted detailed Excel spreadsheets showing all income and expenditures, categorized by program area with supporting documentation for any expenses over $1,000. I expected the report within a week as stipulated in the board bylaws they'd drafted. 3 weeks passed. I sent a follow-up email, then another. Finally, on the 22nd day, I received a PDF attachment from Emma with a brief note. Here's the monthly report you requested. Everything is moving forward beautifully. I opened the PDF and felt my stomach tighten. It wasn't the detailed spreadsheet I'd requested. It was a 1-page summary with vague categories and round numbers that looked suspiciously neat. Program development, $35,000. Administrative setup, $28,000. Consulting fees, $22,000. Marketing and outreach, $15,000. The numbers added up to exactly $100,000. 0 grants distributed. 0 children helped. I composed a careful email asking for itemized receipts and vendor invoices for each category, particularly the consulting fees and marketing expenses. Emma's response came back within an hour, and I could practically hear the forced cheerfulness in her written voice. Hi, Olivia. Those documents are with our accountant for the quarterly filing. We'll have everything ready for the second quarter board meeting in September. Trust me, everything is moving forward beautifully. Trust me. The words jumped off the screen. In my experience, people who asked you to trust them were usually the ones doing things that didn't bear scrutiny. I began my own discreet investigation, applying every technique I'd learned in 6 years of forensic accounting. The marketing agency listed in their expenses had an address in Arlington. I looked it up and found it was a UPS store mailbox. Their website had been registered 2 months ago, featured stock photos of diverse smiling people, and listed no actual clients or portfolio work. The contact page led to a generic Gmail address. The consulting firm that had allegedly received $22,000 was registered to a Margaret Holloway. A quick search revealed she was Diana's college roommate from the early 90s. Her LinkedIn showed she worked in interior design, not nonprofit consulting. I found no evidence she had any relevant expertise that would justify that level of compensation. The program development costs should have resulted in something tangible. A website with a grants portal and application process, public announcements of available funding. I searched for any mention of the Carter Family Foundation offering services. Nothing. Their website was a single landing page with the logo, a mission statement, and a coming soon message that had apparently been coming soon for 2 months. Meanwhile, I'd made the mistake of checking social media. Emma's Instagram stories showed her at a wine tasting in Napa Valley staying at a resort I recognized from a luxury travel article I'd read. I looked up the rates: $800 per night, minimum 3 night stay. Diana's Facebook featured photos of her newly redecorated living room, tagged with restoration hardware. I knew those furniture prices. The sectional sofa alone cost at least $15,000. The foundation money was being spent, just not on charity. I sat at my laptop drafting a formal email demanding an independent forensic audit before I would release any additional funds. I outlined specific questions about each expense category, requested copies of all contracts and invoices, and cited the board bylaws that gave me the right to this information. My finger hovered over the send button. Before I could click it, my phone rang. Emma's name appeared on the screen. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Hello? Her voice came through tight, with barely controlled anger, the fake sweetness from her previous email completely gone. We need to talk about your trust issues, Olivia. This is getting ridiculous. I said, nothing, waiting. Mom just told me you're planning to demand some kind of audit. Are you serious right now? We're trying to build something meaningful here. Something to honor Grandma, and you're sabotaging our family's legacy with your paranoia. She took a breath, her voice dropping to something almost pitying. Mother is very hurt. She's been crying all afternoon because her own daughter doesn't trust her. I looked at the numbers on my screen. $100,000 spent in 6 weeks with nothing to show for it, except vague categories and a fancy logo. I thought about the UPS store mailbox and the college roommates' consulting fees, and Emma's Napa Valley weekend. Emma? I said calmly. Where exactly did the $35,000 for program development go? What programs have been developed? There was a pause. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted to defensive. That's not how it works, Olivia. You can't just snap your fingers and create programs overnight. There's research planning, infrastructure building. This is why we need people with actual nonprofit experience running things, not someone who just knows how to count money. I'm a forensic accountant, I said quietly. Counting money is literally what I do, and right now the money doesn't add up. You know what? Emma's voice rose. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe we should have known you'd turn this into some kind of investigation instead of a family collaboration. You've never been able to just be part of this family without questioning everything, without making everyone feel like criminals. I almost laughed at the irony. I'll send my questions to all board members tomorrow. If you have nothing to hide, transparency shouldn't be a problem. Olivia, I hung up before she could finish. My hands were shaking slightly as I saved the draft email and added Emma's phone call to the growing file of documentation I was building. Whatever they were doing, they were getting sloppy, letting emotions show through their careful performance. That night, I opened Grandma's envelope again and looked at the photograph of Diana with Marcus Blake. I still didn't know who he was or why my blood needed to be tested, but I was starting to understand something fundamental. My family's lies ran deeper than money, and the foundation scam was just the visible tip of something much darker. My phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Chen. Preliminary findings ready. Can you meet tomorrow at 10 a.m.? You'll want to sit down for this. I met with Mr. Chen the next morning at his office in a nondescript building near DuPont Circle. He handed me a folder containing financial records that painted a damning picture. My parents were drowning in debt, leveraged to the breaking point with mortgages and credit lines they could barely service. The house renovations had been financed with a home equity loan. Diana's elegant lifestyle was smoke and mirrors. The foundation wasn't greed, it was desperation. But Chen had found something else too. Something he said he needed more time to verify before sharing. Give me another month, he'd said. What I'm looking into, if I'm right, it changes everything about your family. But I need to be absolutely certain before I show you. I'd agreed though, the waiting felt impossible. In the meantime, I focused on the foundation, documenting every irregularity, building a case that would be impossible to dismiss. By early September, I'd gathered enough evidence to justify demanding the independent audit I'd threatened. I sent the email to all board members formally requesting a forensic review before releasing any additional funds. Diana called within an hour, her voice cold and clipped, but it was Emma who suggested we meet to discuss my concerns in person. I agreed, but insisted on neutral territory. A coffee shop in Georgetown Public. Enough to keep things civil, quiet enough to have a real conversation. I arrived 20 minutes early, ordered a coffee I didn't drink, and positioned my phone in my purse with the voice recorder running. After 6 years of documenting financial crimes, I'd learned that people's own words were often the best evidence against them. Emma walked in looking polished and tense, her designer bag slung over her shoulder, her expression already defensive. She slid into the chair across from me without ordering anything, and immediately went on the offensive. Do you have any idea how much work we've put into this foundation while you sit back and criticize everything? Her voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the anger underneath. We're trying to honor Grandma's memory, and you're treating us like criminals. Do you know how insulting that is? I pulled out my folder and opened it calmly, the same way I'd present findings in a client meeting. Emma, I've identified multiple shell companies in the expense reports. The marketing agency has no legitimate business presence. The consulting fees went to Mom's college roommate who has no relevant expertise. And in 3 months, you've distributed exactly 0 grants to any children. Where did the $100,000 actually go? Her jaw tightened. You don't understand how nonprofits work, Olivia. There are startup costs. Building infrastructure takes time. You can't just start handing out money without proper systems in place. What systems? I interrupted. There's no grant application process, no website beyond a landing page, no staff besides you, and you're being paid a 6-figure salary to produce nothing. This is exactly why we didn't want to include you in the first place. She snapped, her composure starting to crack. You're so negative about everything. You question everything. You make everyone walk on eggshells, always looking for problems, always assuming the worst. I watched her carefully, my forensic training, noting the deflection, the pivot to attacking my character rather than addressing the evidence. I'm not assuming anything. I'm looking at documentation. Numbers don't lie, Emma. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is exactly why Mom never wanted you around. The words burst out of her loud enough that other customers glanced our way. She lowered her voice, but the venom remained. You've always been difficult, always questioning, always making everyone feel judged. She said you were different, that you weren't like us, and she was right. I went very still. The phrasing was odd, specific. What does that mean, not like us? Emma's face flushed as she realized what she'd said. She grabbed her bag, backpedaling quickly. Just your attitude, your personality. You've never fit in with this family, and that's on you, not us. No, I said quietly, standing to face her. That's not what you meant. Explain what she meant by different. Different how? Forget it, Emma said. But her hands were shaking slightly as she adjusted her bag strap. I shouldn't have said anything. Different how, Emma? I pressed. What did Mom tell you about me? She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Uncertainty, maybe, or the realization that she'd revealed more than she'd intended. Ask her yourself if you're so curious, she finally said. I'm done trying to include you in this family. You want to audit the foundation, fine. Do whatever you want, but don't expect us to keep begging for your involvement. She turned and walked out, leaving me standing by our table with my cold coffee and my racing thoughts. I sat back down slowly, my mind replaying those words. You weren't like us. She said you were different. The phrasing wasn't about personality differences or family dynamics. It was more fundamental than that, more biological. I pulled out my phone, stopped the voice recording, and immediately played it back, listening to Emma's exact words. The emphasis she'd put on, like us, wasn't casual. It was significant, revealing. Combined with everything else, the way I looked. Nothing like Diana, the way my mother had reacted to my childhood question about resemblance. Grandma's cryptic warnings about blood not meaning what we think it means. A hypothesis was forming that seemed impossible and yet explained everything. That night, I sat at Grandma's kitchen table and pulled out her letter again, reading it slowly. Test your blood, not just with your father, with Emma, too. The truth is in your blood. Why would I need to test my blood against Emma's? We were sisters, daughters of the same parents. Unless we weren't. Unless one of us wasn't Richard's child or wasn't Diana's, or I opened my laptop and began researching DNA testing procedures. I learned about paternity testing chain of custody requirements, court-admissible laboratories. I found out that sibling DNA tests could determine whether two people shared one parent, both parents, or no parents at all. The science was straightforward. We inherit half our DNA from each parent, so full siblings share approximately 50% of their DNA. Half siblings share 25%. The test could definitively answer whether Emma and I had the same biological parents. But why would Grandma think we didn't? What had she seen or suspected that made her believe the answer would be found in our blood? I made a note to call Mr. Chen first thing in the morning to ask him to accelerate his investigation, to tell him about Emma's slip and Grandma's instructions about DNA testing. I needed answers, not speculation. I was still sitting there, lost in thought, when my email notification chimed. The sender was an address I didn't recognize, a law firm in Portland, Oregon. The subject line read, Marcus Blake Inquiry. My heart started pounding before I even opened it. The message was brief and formal. Ms. Carter, our client, the late Marcus Blake, deceased 2020, left specific instructions with our firm regarding any inquiries about Emma Carter. We have materials he wanted disclosed under these circumstances. Please call our office at your earliest convenience to verify your identity and arrange for secure transfer of these materials. Time-sensitive information enclosed. Whitman and Associates, Attorneys at Law. I stared at the email, reading it 3 times. Marcus Blake. The man from the photograph with my mother had died 4 years ago. But before he died, he'd left instructions about Emma. Not about me, about Emma specifically. Why would my mother's apparent lover from 30 years ago leave instructions about my sister? Unless Emma wasn't just my sister. Unless she was his daughter. The hypothesis that had been forming suddenly crystallized into something that felt horrifyingly, devastatingly true. I reached for my phone with shaking hands and pulled up the photograph. From Grandma's envelope, Diana and Marcus at the art gallery. The intimacy between them obvious. The date from 1993. Emma was born in 1994. The timeline fit, the genetics fit. Emma looking exactly like Diana, but nothing like Richard fit. Mom's panic when I asked about resemblance fit. Everything fit, except my entire understanding of my family. I called the law firm's number, not caring that it was nearly 10 p.m. on the East Coast, 7 p.m. in Portland. A voicemail picked up with office hours. I left a message, my voice surprisingly steady. This is Olivia Carter returning your email about Marcus Blake. I'm available anytime tomorrow. Please call me as soon as possible. Then I sat in Grandma's quiet kitchen holding the photograph of my mother with a man who might be Emma's biological father, and wondered what other lies my family had built their perfect life upon. The Portland law firm called me back at 8 the next morning. The attorney, a woman named Sarah Whitman, was professional and cautious. She explained that Marcus Blake had been her client for the last 3 years of his life, and that he'd left very specific instructions about the materials in his possession. Before she could release them, she needed to verify my identity and my relationship to the Carter family. I provided my driver's license information, birth certificate, and the contact information for a paralegal friend from my Deloitte days, who could serve as a neutral witness to confirm I was who I claimed to be. Sarah seemed satisfied and told me she'd overnight the package via FedEx with signature required. Mr. Blake was very clear that these materials should only be released to someone actively seeking information about Emma Carter, she said. He'd been waiting 3 decades for this moment. I think he'd given up hope it would ever come. The package arrived 2 days later. I signed for it with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, carried it into Grandma's kitchen and stared at it for a full minute before opening it. Inside, carefully organized and labeled folders, was evidence that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. The first item was a handwritten letter dated January 2020, just months before Marcus Blake died. The handwriting was shaky, but legible. The words raw and unfiltered. He began by explaining who he was, a struggling artist in his mid-20s when he met Diana Whitmore at a gallery opening in San Francisco in 1992. She was 25, beautiful, from a wealthy political family, and despite the obvious class difference between them, they fell deeply in love. I'd never felt anything like what I felt for Diana, he wrote. She was everything I wasn't: polished, educated, connected to a world I'd only seen from the outside. But when we were together, none of that mattered. She said I made her feel free. I thought we'd build a life together, something real and honest away from her family's expectations. In spring 1993, Diana discovered she was pregnant. Marcus proposed immediately. They made plans to marry quietly, to move to Portland, where he had friends and could find work to build a life for their child. But Diana's family discovered the pregnancy before they could leave. The letter's tone shifted here, becoming bitter and regretful. Her father and mother were horrified. an illegitimate grandchild fathered by a penniless artist. It would destroy their social standing, ruin their political connections, disgrace the family name. They gave Diana an ultimatum: marry Richard Carter, a man they'd already selected for her pass the baby off as his, or be disowned completely. Cut off from all family support, all money, all connections. Diana had agonized for weeks, Marcus wrote. She'd loved him, he believed that, but she loved the security of her family's approval more. Or maybe she was just terrified of losing everything she'd ever known. Either way, she chose the safe path. Her family paid me $50,000. The letter continued, and I could feel the shame bleeding through the words. At the time, it seemed like an impossible fortune. I was living in a studio apartment with 4 other artists, eating ramen for dinner, wondering how I'd support a child. They made me sign legal documents, waiving all parental rights, promising never to contact Diana or the baby, threatening criminal charges if I violated the agreement. I was 26 years old and terrified, so I took the money. I left California, I changed my phone number, I tried to forget. But he never had forgotten. The letter became a confession and apology to a daughter he'd never known. Emma, if you ever read this, and I hope you do because you deserve to know the truth, I'm sorry. I was young and weak and scared. I chose money over you. I abandoned you before you were even born. Your mother loved me once, but she loved her family's approval more. Neither of us was brave enough to choose you. I've lived with that shame for 30 years. I hope knowing the truth brings you some peace, even if you can never forgive me. The second folder contained photographs I'd never seen before. Diana and Marcus on a beach, her head thrown back in laughter, his arm around her waist. Diana and Marcus at the same art gallery from Grandma's photo, but this one showed them kissing, lost in each other. Diana and Marcus at a small cafe, her head resting on his shoulder, both of them looking young and in love and doomed. The third folder contained the most important item, a sealed medical vial containing a DNA sample, accompanied by extensive documentation. Marcus explained that in his final months, knowing he was dying, he'd gone to a certified medical laboratory and had his DNA collected and preserved, specifically for this purpose. The chain of custody paperwork was impeccable, witnessed by 2 medical professionals, notarized, stored in compliance with forensic standards. If Emma or anyone in the Carter family ever seeks the truth, he'd written, my blood can provide it. This sample is court admissible. It's proof that I existed, that she came from me, that the lie her mother told for 3 decades can finally be exposed. I sat at Grandma's table for hours, reading and rereading that letter, studying those photographs, processing what this meant. Diana had been pregnant with Emma when she married Richard. Richard had known from the beginning that Emma wasn't his biological child. But he'd agreed to raise her as his own, to participate in the lie. Then 2 years later, I was born Richard's actual biological daughter. But instead of favoring his real child, Richard had pushed me aside. He'd sent me away. He'd ignored my existence while lavishing attention on the child who wasn't even his blood. Why? What kind of twisted logic or guilt or manipulation had made him choose the lie over his own daughter? The next morning I called Mr. Chen and told him everything. His response was measured, but not surprised. Your grandmother suspected something like this. She didn't have proof, but she watched your mother's face for 30 years and she knew Diana was hiding something fundamental. This confirms it. Then I called a specialized DNA laboratory that handled legal cases and chain of custody requirements. I arranged for 3 tests. The first would confirm paternity between me and Richard. I needed to know with absolute certainty that I was his biological daughter. The second would use Marcus's preserved sample to test against Emma's DNA, which I could obtain from items in her childhood bedroom that my parents had preserved like a shrine. The third would test me against Diana, just to complete the picture. The lab technician explained the process would take approximately 2 weeks for all results. I provided the necessary documentation, signed the authorization forms, and left the testing center, feeling like I was standing at the edge of a cliff about to jump without knowing what waited below. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed with a voicemail notification from an unknown number. I played it and heard my mother's voice trembling with an emotion I couldn't quite place, fear maybe, or desperation. Olivia, it's Mom. We know you've been investigating us. We know you've been asking questions, hiring people, digging into things that should stay buried. This is going to destroy our family. Everything we've built, everything we've protected for 30 years, you're about to tear it all down. Please, can we talk before you do something you'll regret? Before you make this public, please call me back. I stood in the parking lot holding my phone and realized my mother wasn't asking for reconciliation or understanding. She was asking for silence. She'd spent 3 decades protecting her lie, And now that it was about to be exposed, she wanted me to be complicit in bearing it again. But I'd already submitted the DNA samples. The truth was already in motion, and there was no stopping it now. I didn't call my mother back. Instead, I waited. 2 weeks felt like 2 years, but I forced myself to maintain my normal routine, working remotely from Grandma's house, attending virtual meetings for my new government position, responding to Foundation emails with professional neutrality. I gave Diana and Richard no indication that I was about to uncover their deepest secret. The DNA results arrived on a gray October afternoon via secure email portal. I was alone in Grandma's house, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea. I didn't drink, my laptop open in front of me. I entered the access code the lab had provided, and watched the PDF load, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Result: 1. Olivia Carter and Richard Carter. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. The number was definitive, irrefutable. I was Richard's biological daughter. Whatever lies my family had told, whatever secrets they'd buried, this was certain truth. He was my father. I was his child. Result 2. Emma Carter and Richard Carter. Probability of paternity, 0%. No genetic markers matched, no shared DNA beyond random population overlap. Emma was not Richard's daughter, not biologically, not genetically, not in any measurable scientific way. Result 3. Emma Carter and Marcus Blake. Comparison using preserved sample. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. Emma was Marcus Blake's daughter. The struggling artist from the photographs, the man Diana had loved before choosing security. The man who'd taken $50,000 to disappear, he was Emma's biological father. Result: 4. Olivia Carter and Diana Carter. Results inconclusive due to sample quality, hair sample degraded, but analysis suggests no significant shared genetic markers beyond standard population baseline. I was not Diana's biological daughter. I stared at those numbers until they blurred. Everything I'd believed about my family, about my rejection, about why I wasn't wanted, all of it was inverted backwards, the opposite of what I'd assumed. Diana had rejected me not because I was her daughter, but because I wasn't. Emma had been favored not despite being an affair baby, but because she was Diana, his biological child, the product of actual love rather than an arranged marriage. Richard had pushed aside his own flesh and blood, while raising another man's daughter as his princess. The cruelty wasn't random. It was calculated, systematic, twisted by 30 years of secrets and shame. I spent 3 days processing this information without telling anyone. I walked circles through Grandma's garden, sat in her reading chair by the window, made tea. I forgot to drink, tried to understand the psychology that could create such a profoundly dysfunctional family structure. Diana had married Richard while pregnant with another man's child. Richard had agreed to the deception, had raised Emma knowing she wasn't his, had given her his name and his affection and his protection. Then, I came along 2 years later, the actual biological daughter, the living proof of their marriage, and somehow I became the threat. I kept returning to that moment when 7-year-old me had asked why I looked like Daddy, but Emma didn't. I could see it so clearly now. Diana's face draining of color, her hands shaking, the panic in her eyes. I hadn't been asking an innocent question. I'd been identifying the genetic truth that their entire lie was built to hide. If I stayed in that house, kept observing, kept asking questions, eventually I'd notice more. Eventually someone else might notice. Eventually the whole carefully constructed facade would collapse. Sending me away hadn't been about dislike or favoritism. It had been about bearing evidence. I was the proof of their deception, the genetic marker that didn't fit their story. The daughter who looked too much like Richard, and not enough like Diana. Easier to remove me than to risk exposure. On the 4th day, I made a strategic decision. I would not confront them yet. I would not reveal what I knew. If I called them now, showed them the DNA results, demanded explanations, they would close ranks immediately. Diana would craft some narrative, Richard would lawyer up. Emma would be positioned as the innocent victim, and I'd be painted as the vindictive daughter manufacturing evidence to hurt her family. They'd destroy documents, align their stories, prepare for battle. No. I needed to build an airtight case first. Document the Foundation fraud with evidence so clear it couldn't be dismissed. Gather financial records proving their desperation and deception. Create a legal paper trail showing pattern and intent. Then, and only then, I deploy the DNA evidence, not as an opening salvo, but as the nuclear option, the truth bomb they couldn't defuse. I called Patricia Reeves, the family law attorney my former colleague had recommended. She agreed to meet me that afternoon at her office in Bethesda. For 2 hours I laid out everything. The foundation scam, the shell companies, Diana's college roommate collecting, consulting fees, Marcus Blake's confession, and finally, the DNA results. I showed her the documentation, the photographs, the lab reports. Patricia listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on her legal pad. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and studied me for a long moment. Olivia, I need to be very clear with you. What you're describing isn't just family dysfunction or financial impropriety. This is fraud, identity deception spanning 3 decades, and potentially criminal conspiracy. If you pursue this, you're not just going to hurt your family's feelings, you're going to destroy their lives. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed? I thought about being 7 years old, bags packed, watching my parents drive away. I thought about graduation day, scanning the crowd for faces that never came. I thought about Diana's Facebook post during my ceremony about Richard's voice saying, "It's just a degree," about Emma's bitter accusation that I'd always been selfish. Yes, I said. I'm certain. They destroyed my life first. I'm just making it visible. Patricia nodded slowly. Then, we're going to need to move very carefully. Let's start building the case. I left her office feeling focused and clear-headed for the first time in weeks. I had a plan. I had evidence. I had an attorney who understood the stakes. Now I just needed to be patient. That patience lasted exactly 6 hours. I was back at Grandma's house making dinner and reviewing my notes from the meeting with Patricia when my phone started buzzing with texts. The first was from a former colleague at Deloitte. "Olivia, did you see the article in DC Business Journal? Is everything okay?" My stomach dropped. I opened my laptop and searched for my name in the publication. The article appeared immediately, published just 2 hours earlier in their online edition. The headline made my blood run cold. "Rising Star or Family Betrayer, The Dark Side of Olivia Carter." The piece was written with just enough vagueness to avoid being obviously libelous, but the implications were devastating. It alleged I was using my position and professional expertise to extort my grieving family over an inheritance dispute. It quoted sources close to the family, describing concerning behavior, patterns, paranoia, trust issues, and inability to accept familial love. It suggested that someone with access to classified government information who demonstrated such troubling interpersonal dysfunction should be subject to additional security screening. The article never quite accused me of anything specific. It just raised questions, planted doubts, created a narrative where I was the unstable aggressor and my family were the victims of my vindictiveness. It was subtle enough to be protected speech, damaging enough to destroy my security clearance. Diana had found out I was investigating her, and she'd struck first. The article spread through my professional network faster than I could have imagined. Within 24 hours, I had 6 LinkedIn messages from former colleagues, all carefully worded with concern that barely masked curiosity. "Saw something online, just wanted to check if you're okay. And if there's any truth to those allegations, you know you can talk to me, right?" The subtext was clear. They were asking if I was actually the person described in that article, if I was really using my skills to intimidate my grieving family, if I was as unstable as the piece suggested. I tried to craft responses that were professional and calm, brief explanations about an inheritance dispute and family tensions that had nothing to do with my work. But I could feel the damage spreading with each awkward exchange, each carefully neutral reply that made me sound defensive no matter how I phrased it. 3 days after the article published, my security manager at the defense contractor called me. His name was Frank Delgado, a former military intelligence officer, who'd been friendly but professional during my onboarding process. Now his voice was formal, detached. "Olivia, we need you to come in for a routine check-in. Just some questions about your current security status. Can you be here tomorrow at 10? It wasn't routine. I knew that from his tone, from the timing, from the fact that he'd called instead of emailing. But I agreed because refusing would only make things worse. The meeting took place in a windowless conference room with Frank and a woman from HR I'd never met before. They sat across from me with a file folder between them, and Frank opened with the line I'd been dreading. "We've received some concerning information about potential personal conflicts that might affect your judgment and reliability. Can you explain this situation with your family?" I kept my voice steady and provided the explanation I'd prepared. My grandmother had passed away, leaving me her estate. My parents and sister were unhappy with the inheritance distribution, and there were some tensions around a family foundation they wanted me to fund. I framed it as a civil disagreement, nothing that affected my work or my ability to handle classified information. Frank nodded, made notes, but I could see doubt in his eyes. The HR woman asked if I was under any financial pressure, if anyone was attempting to coerce or manipulate me, if I felt my family situation could be used as leverage against me. All standard security questions, but asked with an edge that suggested they'd already formed an opinion. No financial pressure, I said truthfully. I inherited enough to be financially secure, and no one can leverage my family against me because we're essentially estranged. But you're currently involved in founding a family charity with them, the HR woman asked, referencing something she'd clearly read in the article. I was asked to contribute to a foundation they proposed. I've raised some concerns about the financial structure and haven't released additional funds pending review. That's the extent of my involvement. The meeting ended with Frank promising to follow up after they completed their review. 1 week later, I received the email I'd been expecting, but hoping wouldn't come. Your contract is temporarily suspended pending completion of security review process. This is standard procedure and should not be interpreted as an accusation of wrongdoing. We will update you as the review progresses. Standard procedure. Devastating reality. My $2.5 million contract, the position I'd been so proud to accept, the career achievement that had made my family suddenly notice me, gone. Suspended. Under review, and everyone in the defense industry would hear about it, would wonder what I'd done to trigger a security investigation. The professional damage spread in ways I hadn't anticipated. A speaking invitation I'd received to present at a fraud prevention conference in December was quietly rescinded with an apologetic email about scheduling conflicts. Networking contacts who usually responded to my messages within hours now took days, or didn't respond at all. Most painfully, work friendships that I'd cultivated over years began to cool. People stopped inviting me to virtual happy hours. A former colleague who usually texted me funny memes about accounting stopped texting entirely. Diana had found my vulnerability and struck precisely. She'd weaponized my career success, turned my professional credibility into a liability by suggesting I was using my forensic skills and government connections to bully my poor grieving family. The narrative she'd created was brilliant in its simplicity. I was powerful. They were victims. I was the aggressor. They were defending themselves. Never mind that they'd been the ones to approach me to ask for my money to create the fraudulent foundation. In the court of public opinion, they'd positioned themselves perfectly. I sat in Grandma's living room on a Friday evening in mid-November, watching the light fade from the windows, feeling the walls close in. For the first time since I was 7 years old, standing in this same house with my suitcases, I felt completely alone. My career was in shambles. My family was actively trying to destroy me. My reputation was being systematically dismantled by accusations I couldn't refute without making myself look more defensive and unstable. Maybe pursuing the truth wasn't worth this. Maybe I should have just walked away when they first approached me about the foundation, blocked their numbers, moved on with my life. Maybe Diana won because she was willing to burn everything down, and I wasn't willing to do the same. I opened my laptop and started drafting an email to Patricia Reeves. I'm withdrawing from all family contact effective immediately. Please do not file any lawsuits or take any legal action. I just want to be left alone. My finger hovered over the keyboard, the cursor blinking in the empty space after that last sentence. Was this really what Grandma would have wanted for me to surrender, to let them win, to protect people who'd never protected me? Before I could finish the thought, an email notification popped up from Mr. Chen. The subject line read, "Additional Blake findings important." I opened it, expecting another piece of the puzzle about Marcus and Diana's affair. What I found was so much more. Chen had obtained bank records from 1993 showing a wire transfer of $50,000 from Diana's father's account to Marcus Blake's account, dated 2 weeks before Diana's wedding to Richard. The transfer memo line read, "Settlement payment per agreement." He'd also found Richard's prenuptial agreement with Diana filed with the county clerk's office. Buried in the standard language about asset division was a clause referring to existing minor dependent and Richard's agreement to assume all parental responsibilities for said dependent, as if biological offspring. Richard had known before the wedding, his family had known. They'd drawn up legal documents protecting themselves, ensuring Richard wouldn't be financially responsible for Emma if the marriage dissolved. The whole thing had been a calculated transaction. But the most significant finding was a sealed lawsuit from 2005. Chen had accessed court records showing that Diana had been sued by a former business partner for defamation and tortious interference. The partner claimed Diana had spread false rumors about financial impropriety to destroy her reputation and steal clients. The case had been settled confidentially with a substantial payment and a mutual non-disclosure agreement, but the initial filings were still on record showing a pattern. Diana had done this before, used reputation destruction as a weapon when she felt threatened. I read Chen's email twice, then looked at my half-written surrender message. Diana wasn't going to stop. Even if I walked away, even if I gave up the inheritance, even if I disappeared from their lives, entirely, she'd keep attacking because she couldn't risk me eventually telling the truth. The only way this ended was if I fought back with everything I had. I deleted the surrender email. Instead, I forwarded everything to Patricia Reeves, the DNA results, Marcus's confession, Chen's financial findings, the prenuptial agreement, the 2005 lawsuit, and the foundation fraud evidence. My message was short. File the lawsuit, all of it. I'm done protecting people who've never protected me. Patricia responded within minutes. Drafting documents tonight? You'll have them to review tomorrow. Olivia, this is the right choice. I closed my laptop and sat in the gathering darkness of Grandma's living room, no longer feeling alone. I could almost feel her presence, hear her voice saying what she'd said so many times. Your worth doesn't come from their approval. They'd taken my childhood. They'd taken my family. Now they were trying to take my career and my reputation. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd assumed I was still that frightened 7-year-old girl who could be sent away without a fight. I wasn't. Patricia and I spent December and January building what she called the most thoroughly documented family law case she'd seen in 20 years of practice. We met twice a week at her office in Bethesda, spreading evidence across her conference table like pieces of an elaborate puzzle. The strategy was dual-track a civil lawsuit seeking damages for defamation, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, combined with a criminal complaint to the D.C. District Attorney's Office for foundation embezzlement. And what Patricia grimly predicted would be an inevitable false police report when they realize how serious this is. I provided documentation that made Patricia raise her eyebrows in professional appreciation. Foundation and corporation papers showing shell companies registered to Diana's friends. Email trails, where Emma discussed managing my expectations. Recordings of conversations completely legal in D.C. A one-party consent. Jurisdiction where they promised transparency they never delivered. Financial forensics proving the $100,000 had disappeared into personal accounts disguised as consulting fees and administrative costs. And the DNA evidence held in reserve like a nuclear weapon we'd deploy only when the moment was strategically perfect. Most clients give me shoeboxes of random papers and emotional testimony, Patricia said, reviewing my organized binders. You're giving me prosecutor quality evidence. Your forensic training is showing. Mr. Chen continued his investigation, uncovering layers I hadn't anticipated. The elegant house, the designer furniture, the expensive renovations, all financed by debt, not wealth. Richard wasn't the successful executive I'd assumed. He was a senior vice president, facing mandatory retirement at 62. His pension inadequate to maintain their lifestyle. They'd borrowed against their home equity twice, maxing out at $400,000. Diana's credit cards carried balances totaling another $80,000. The foundation scam wasn't greed. It was desperation masked by designer labels and perfect landscaping. Chen also documented Diana's pattern of relationship destruction. A former friend from her junior league days who'd stopped calling in 2012, Chen found her and she remembered. Diana spreading whispers that the woman was going through something very unstable, best to give her space. A cousin who drifted away in 2016, after questioning Diana about some family finances. Suddenly she was difficult, always stirring up drama. 3 different people over 15 years, all alienated with the same technique: preemptive character assassination before they could discover Diana's secrets or challenge her control. In mid-January, Patricia walked me through the litigation timeline. If we file and they fight, expect 18 to 24 months to reach trial. Discovery will be brutal: depositions, interrogatories, document requests. They'll dig into every corner of your life looking for ammunition. But given your evidence quality, I estimate a 70% chance they'll seek settlement within 6 months. 90% chance we never actually see a courtroom. The DNA evidence alone makes trial impossibly risky for them. She leaned forward, her expression serious. But, Olivia, I need you to understand the emotional cost. These people will stop being your family and become legal adversaries. They'll try to depose you, twist your words, paint you as vindictive and unstable. They'll make private pain public record. Are you prepared for that? I thought about being 7 years old watching my parents drive away. I thought about graduation day scanning an empty audience. I thought about Diana's voice on that voicemail, not apologizing, but demanding I protect her secrets. They became my adversaries when I was 7 years old, I said calmly. I'm just finally acknowledging it. We finalized the lawsuit documents in late January. The complaint was devastating but legally airtight: 43 pages detailing decades of emotional abuse, documented financial fraud, and a defamation campaign that cost me my career. We set the filing date for February 1st, giving me a weekend to review the final draft and emotionally prepare for what came next. On January 28th, 3 days before we'd file, I received a certified letter at Grandma's house. The return address was a law firm I didn't recognize, Blackwell and Associates, a white shoe firm in downtown DC that charged $1,000 an hour. My hands shook slightly as I signed for it. Inside was a cease and desist letter on expensive letterhead signed by an attorney named Theodore Blackwell. The language was aggressive and threatening. I was to immediately stop all defamatory communications about the Carter family. My campaign of intimidation and harassment would result in criminal charges if it continued. My hiring of private investigators constituted stalking under DC law, and they were prepared to seek restraining orders. It was a bluff. Everything Chen had done was legal. Everything I documented was factual. But the letter's existence told me something crucial. They knew I was building towards something big, and they were panicking. I photographed the letter, forwarded it to Patricia with a brief message. "They're scared. Proceed as planned." Her response came within minutes. "This is exactly what I expected. They're trying to intimidate you into backing down. Don't." We file Saturday morning. I looked at the cease and desist letter one more time, then filed it carefully in my evidence binder. In 3 days they discover I don't intimidate easily. In 3 days the war became official. We filed the lawsuit on Saturday morning, February 1st. Patricia submitted it electronically to the DC Superior Court at 9 a.m., and by noon a process server was at my parents' house delivering the formal complaint. I'd asked for a photo confirmation of service, and the image showed my father answering the door in weekend casual, where his face going pale as he accepted the envelope. By Sunday evening Diana had retained Theodore Blackwell's firm, and by Monday afternoon I received notice that they were preparing a response. The response arrived Wednesday. It wasn't a simple answer to my complaint. It was a full counter lawsuit, 38 pages of allegations that made my hands shake as I read them. Diana claimed I was blackmailing the family with fabricated evidence about Emma's parentage, demanding payment to keep quiet about false allegations that would destroy their reputation. The countersuit painted me as an unstable, vindictive daughter who'd weaponized my forensic investigation skills to manufacture a scandal, who was extorting my grieving family for money I didn't deserve, who'd created an elaborate fiction to justify my greed. It was a masterpiece of projection, accusing me of exactly what they were doing. But Diana didn't stop there. On Thursday, I received a call from Detective Marcus Williams of the Metropolitan Police Department's Fraud Division. His voice was professional but cautious. "Miss Carter, we've received a criminal complaint regarding alleged threatening communications you sent to your family members. I'd like you to come in to discuss this matter. You're not under arrest, but we do need to talk." I sat in an interrogation room Friday afternoon, a space I'd been in before, but always on the other side as an expert witness, helping prosecutors, not as a suspect. Detective Williams was in his 50s, methodical and calm. He showed me printouts of emails allegedly sent from an address that looked almost identical to mine, oliviacarter@gmail.com, instead of my actual olivia.carterm@gmail.com. The one-letter difference was subtle enough that someone glancing quickly might miss it. The emails were crude in their obviousness. "Pay me $500,000, or I'll expose your family's secrets to everyone. I have evidence that will destroy you. Let's discuss terms for my silence." The language was nothing like how I actually wrote. The tone was cartoonishly threatening, and the entire concept was absurd. I was a forensic accountant who'd spent 6 years investigating financial crimes. If I were actually going to blackmail someone, I certainly wouldn't do it via easily traceable emails with explicit threats. I calmly explained this to Detective Williams. I provided my actual email account logs, showing I'd never sent these messages. I explained my professional background and asked him if it seemed likely that someone with my training would be stupid enough to commit extortion in writing. I could see sympathy in his eyes, but he said what he had to say. "I understand, Miss Carter, but we need to investigate all complaints. This will take some time. Please don't leave the jurisdiction." I walked out of the police station and sat in my car for 20 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, wondering if I was about to be arrested for a crime I didn't commit. Diana had actually filed a false police report. She'd fabricated evidence and submitted it to law enforcement. She was so desperate to stop me that she'd crossed into criminal behavior. The same day I was being questioned by police, I received an email from the defense contractor's HR department. The subject line was professionally neutral, but the content was devastating. "Due to ongoing legal complications that prevent security clearance, maintenance, we are terminating your contract effective immediately. This decision is final and not subject to appeal. $2.5 million. Gone." The career achievement I'd been so proud of, the position that had made my family suddenly notice me, destroyed by Diana's calculated assault on my reputation. My professional network had evaporated entirely. Former colleagues who'd once sought my expertise now didn't return emails. I'd burned through $45,000 in attorney fees in just 6 weeks. My savings, carefully accumulated over a decade, were being depleted at an alarming rate. The inheritance from Grandma would cover it, but watching my financial security erode felt like watching my life's work dissolve. I sat in Grandma's house that night, the same house where I'd been sent at 7 years old, and felt the walls closing in. Diana was winning. She'd destroyed my career, isolated me professionally, and now she was trying to have me arrested. Maybe she would succeed. Maybe I'd lose everything: my reputation, my freedom, my future, all because I dared to challenge her lies. My phone rang. Patricia Reeves. I almost didn't answer, afraid of more bad news. Olivia. Her voice was tight with controlled anger, but underneath I heard something else triumph. I just got Diana's countersuit filing, and Olivia, she made a critical mistake, a huge one. I sat up straighter. What mistake? She presented those fake emails as evidence in a court filing. She attached them as exhibits to her countersuit, swearing under penalty of perjury that they're authentic communications from you, which means she just submitted fraudulent documents to a court. I felt my heart start pounding, and that's a felony, Patricia finished. Submitting false evidence to a court is a federal crime, and we can prove those emails are fake. The metadata will show they originated from her IP address, not yours. The writing style doesn't match your documented communications. She just handed us everything we need. For the first time in weeks, I felt something besides fear and exhaustion. I felt hope. What do we do? I asked. We let the police investigation run its course. They'll discover the emails are fake, they have forensic experts, and then we file a motion showing Diana submitted known fraudulent evidence to the court. She doesn't just lose the countersuit, Olivia. She faces criminal charges. I closed my eyes, letting that sink in. Diana had been so desperate to destroy me that she'd destroyed herself instead. When? I asked. Give me 1 week to compile the forensic evidence, then we move. Patricia moved quickly. Within 3 days, she'd compiled a comprehensive digital forensics report and submitted it to Detective Williams. The report was devastating in its clarity: the IP addresses of the threatening emails traced directly to Diana's home internet connection. The metadata showed they'd been created using a free email service accessed from a laptop that Mr. Chen's technology expert identified as Diana's personal device by cross-referencing the machine's digital fingerprint with other emails she'd sent over the years. Even the writing patterns matched Diana's documented communication style, her tendency to use dramatic language, her specific punctuation habits, the way she structured threats. Detective Williams called me on a Wednesday morning in early March, exactly 1 year after Grandma had passed away. Miss Carter, I'm closing the investigation. The forensic evidence clearly shows those emails didn't originate from your accounts or devices. I'm filing a report noting that this complaint appears to be malicious and false. I'm sorry you were put through this. I thanked him, my voice steadier than I felt. After we hung up, I sat in Grandma's kitchen and let the relief wash over me. I wasn't going to be arrested. The false accusation had failed. But Detective Williams had said something else that made my hands shake. I'm forwarding my findings to the district attorney's office. Filing a false police report is a felony in D.C. They may want to pursue charges. Diana had tried to have me arrested, and in doing so she'd committed a crime herself. Simultaneously, Diana's legal team was discovering just how untenable their position had become. During the discovery process, Patricia had requested, and the court had ordered, production of the Carter Family Foundation's complete financial records. Diana's attorneys had no choice but to comply. When the records arrived, Patricia called me with barely contained satisfaction in her voice. Olivia, they sent everything. Bank statements, vendor invoices, expense reports. And it's exactly what we suspected. The shell companies can't be explained away. They're registered to Diana's friends with no legitimate business operations. The consulting fees went to people with no relevant expertise. Emma's $120,000 salary is documented while the foundation distributed 0 grants to any children. And the bank account subpoena shows the money trailed Diana's restoration hardware. Purchases, Emma's Napa Valley resort charges, Richard's country club dues. They used foundation money for personal expenses and documented it themselves. 2 days later, Theodore Blackwell called Patricia seeking settlement negotiations. I wasn't on the call, but Patricia recounted the conversation to me afterward, her tone dry with professional amusement. He asked what it would take to resolve this without trial. I told him we'd consider settlement after the DNA evidence is presented on the official record. I said your clients have been lying for 31 years. That ends now. There was a very long silence, then he said he'd need to consult with his clients. Patricia explained that we were now in the strongest possible position. Diana couldn't go to trial because the evidence would destroy them publicly and permanently. They couldn't settle without acknowledging wrongdoing, which would open them to criminal prosecution. And with the DA investigating the false police report, Diana faced criminal charges regardless of what happened with our civil case. We're going to schedule a pre-trial hearing, Patricia said. I want to present the DNA evidence to the judge as part of our motion to amend the complaint. Once it's in the official court record, it becomes legal fact, public record, no more secrets, no more lies. I agreed, but as I hung up the phone, I felt the weight of what was coming. When the DNA evidence became public, Emma's entire identity would shatter. She'd learned that her father wasn't her father, that her mother had lied to her for 31 years, that her whole life had been built on a deception she'd had no part in creating. Emma hadn't asked to be born from an affair. She hadn't asked to be the instrument of my exclusion. She was in many ways as much a victim of Diana's lies as I was. For a moment I considered calling Patricia back, asking if there was a way to protect Emma from the fallout. A way to expose the fraud without destroying an innocent woman's sense of self. Patricia called me before I could call her, as if she'd sensed my hesitation. Olivia, I know what you're thinking. You're worried about Emma. But listen to me carefully. Emma is 31 years old. She deserves to know the truth about her own biology. Keeping secrets to protect people who've never protected you isn't mercy. It's self-sacrifice. And you've sacrificed enough. Emma will survive this truth. People survive worse revelations every day. What she won't survive is living a lie forever. I closed my eyes knowing Patricia was right, but still feeling the weight of what I was about to do. When? I asked. The pre-trial hearing is scheduled for April 15th, 2 weeks from today. Diana will be notified tomorrow that we intend to present genetic evidence. I want her to know it's coming. Want her to spend 2 weeks panicking, knowing there's nothing she can do to stop it. I imagined the phone call Diana would receive from Theodore Blackwell the moment she'd realize her deepest secret was about to become court record. I imagined her panic, her desperate attempts to find a way out, her realization that there was none. And I felt nothing but cold certainty. This was justice. This was truth. This was 31 years of lies finally ending. Do it, I said. The pre-trial hearing took place on a cold April morning in courtroom 4B of the D.C. Superior Court. Judge Michaela Torres presided, a woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair and a reputation for running an efficient, no-nonsense courtroom. Patricia had requested the hearing be closed to the public to protect Emma's privacy, and ironically Diana's attorney had readily agreed. They didn't want this becoming a public spectacle any more than we did. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Patricia, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from shaking. Across the aisle, Diana sat ramrod straight in a black suit, her face carefully composed, but her eyes darting nervously. Richard sat beside her, looking older than I'd ever seen him, his shoulders hunched. Emma was there too, positioned between her parents, looking exhausted and confused. I watched her lean toward Diana and whisper something, probably asking why she'd been summoned to a civil hearing about foundation finances. Judge Torres called the hearing to order and invited Patricia to present. My attorney stood, collected her materials, and began with surgical precision to dismantle the foundation fraud. She displayed bank records on the courtroom screen showing the $100,000 I'd contributed, flowing into the foundation account, then fragmenting into dozens of smaller transactions. She showed vendor invoices, or rather the lack of legitimate vendor invoices. She presented email trails where Emma discussed managing my expectations, and Diana planned how to handle my audit requests. Theodore Blackwell attempted to intervene, arguing these were merely accounting irregularities and misunderstandings common in new nonprofit organizations. Judge Torres looked at him over her reading glasses with an expression that suggested she'd heard better excuses from parking violators. Mr. Blackwell, your client operated a foundation for 6 months, collected $100,000, distributed 0 grants, and paid the executive director a 6-figure salary. That's not a misunderstanding. That's fraud. Continue, Ms. Reeves. Patricia moved to the second part of her presentation. Your Honor, I'd like to present genetic evidence that speaks to motive and pattern of deception in this case. She explained the chain of custody for Marcus Blake's DNA sample, how it had been collected, preserved, and notarized before his death. She described the court-certified laboratory that had processed the comparison tests. Then she submitted the lab reports as exhibits and projected the results on the screen. I watched Emma's face as she read the words, saw the exact moment comprehension struck. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to horror in the space of 3 seconds. The courtroom was completely silent as Judge Torres read aloud Sample A, Olivia Carter, and Sample B, Richard Carter. 99.9% probability of paternity, she paused. Sample C, Emma Carter, and Sample B, Richard Carter, 0% match. Another pause. Sample C, Emma Carter, and Sample D, Marcus Blake. Deceased, 99.9% probability of paternity. Emma's face drained of all color. She turned slowly to Diana, her voice breaking. Mom? Diana couldn't speak. She just stared at the floor, her carefully composed mask finally shattering. Emma turned to Richard. Did you know? Richard closed his eyes and nodded, unable to meet her gaze. Judge Torres, her expression softening with unexpected compassion, announced a 15-minute recess. The hallway outside the courtroom erupted into chaos. Emma cornered Diana against the wall, her voice rising with each word. Tell me this isn't true. Tell me I'm Dad's daughter. Tell me my entire life isn't a lie. Diana, trapped and broken, whispered something I could barely hear. I was going to tell you when you were older, but then there was never a right time. A right time. Emma's voice cracked. I'm 31 years old. You had 31 years to find the right time. She whirled toward Richard. You knew you've known my whole life that I wasn't your daughter, and you never said anything. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. He just nodded again, and I saw tears in his eyes for the first time I could remember. Then Emma turned to me, and for the first time since we were children, there was no hostility in her expression. Just raw, shared trauma. You knew. How long have you known? 2 months, I said quietly. I needed to be sure before destroying your world. Emma laughed a bitter, broken sound. How considerate of you. She looked at all of us. Diana, Richard, me, the lawyers, the courthouse walls, and something in her seemed to collapse. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the marble hallway. Diana started to follow, but Patricia stepped forward. Mrs. Carter, we're due back in court in 8 minutes. I suggest you compose yourself. When we reconvened, the energy in the courtroom had fundamentally shifted. Judge Torres looked at Diana's attorney with something approaching pity. Mr. Blackwell, does your client wish to respond to these findings, or shall we proceed to discussing settlement terms and potential criminal referrals? Blackwell requested a private consultation with his client. They stepped into the hallway, and through the courtroom's glass door I could see Diana's animated gestures, her desperate attempts to find a way out. Blackwell's expression remained professionally neutral, but his body language said everything. There was no defense for this. When they returned, Blackwell's voice was resigned. Your Honor, my client requests a continuation to consider plea negotiations for the potential criminal charges and settlement terms for the civil claims. We recognize the evidence presented today is significant. Judge Torres nodded. I'm granting a 30-day continuation. Mr. Blackwell, I strongly suggest your client use that time wisely. Ms. Reeves, please coordinate with the DA's office regarding the criminal complaint. This court is adjourned. I walked out of the courthouse into the April sunshine, feeling simultaneously triumphant and hollow. The truth was now legal record. Diana's 31-year lie had been exposed in a court of law, documented and filed and permanent. But as I reached my car, I couldn't stop thinking about Emma's face when she'd read those DNA results, the way her entire identity had shattered in the space of 90 seconds. I'd won. But the victory felt more complicated than I'd expected. Richard called me 2 days after the hearing. I almost didn't answer when I saw his name on my phone, but something made me pick up. His voice was strained, older somehow, stripped of the professional polish I'd always associated with him. Olivia, I need to talk to you. Privately, not about the lawsuit or the settlement. Just, I need you to hear something from me. Please. We met at a small park near the courthouse, one of those neglected green spaces, with a few benches and overgrown landscaping that tourists never visit. Richard was already there when I arrived, sitting on a bench with his shoulders slumped, looking 10 years older than he had just days ago in court. He'd aged visibly in 48 hours. I sat down, keeping distance between us, and waited. He began without looking at me, his voice quiet. I need you to understand why I did what I did, even though I know it doesn't excuse anything. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just need you to know the whole truth. He explained that in 1993, his family and Diana's family had arranged their marriage. It wasn't love, at least not initially. It was business. 2 old Washington families preserving social standing, political connections, generational wealth. My father told me Diana Whitmore was an appropriate match. Her family had the right connections. It would be good for both our futures. When Diana confessed she was pregnant with another man's child, Richard's family had given him a choice: call off the wedding and face public humiliation and lost business opportunities worth millions, or proceed with the marriage and raise the child as his own. They made it very clear what the right choice was. But the thing is, Olivia, I was already in love with Diana by then. He finally looked at me, his eyes hollow. I know it sounds absurd given how the marriage was arranged, but I'd fallen for her during our engagement. She was beautiful and intelligent, and I thought if I was generous enough, if I loved Emma as my own daughter, Diana would eventually love me back. I was 28, and naive enough to believe love could be earned. So he'd married Diana, raised Emma with genuine affection, and hoped for a fresh start. Then 2 years later, I was born. You were my biological daughter, he said, his voice breaking slightly. My blood. And the moment I held you in the hospital, I felt something different. Something primal and immediate that I hadn't felt with Emma. I tried to hide it, but Diana saw. She saw how I looked at you, and she became distant, cold. That's when I realized the truth. She'd tolerate me raising Emma out of guilt and obligation, but she wouldn't tolerate me loving my actual child more than her daughter. The choice he'd made was calculated and cowardly. I chose my marriage over my daughter. I convinced myself you'd be fine with your grandmother, that you were resilient, that Diana's happiness was necessary to keep the family intact. Every birthday I missed, every graduation I skipped, I told myself I was protecting something bigger than just one relationship, but I was just protecting my own comfort. I was a coward. He revealed something I hadn't known when I turned 18. He'd established a trust fund in my name, using inheritance from his own father. $1.2 million accessible when I turned 35, set up through a law firm Diana knew nothing about. It was the only thing I could give you that she couldn't take away or control. I thought maybe it would be enough to say, I did love you, love. I just loved my comfort more. I sat very still processing this. The trust fund would be accessible next year. He'd been planning this for 17 years. Did you ever tell Diana you knew I was your daughter? I asked quietly, that you were choosing between us. Richard's voice cracked. She knew. God, she knew. And she made it very clear if I publicly favored you, if I disrupted the fiction of our perfect family, she'd expose Emma's parentage herself and blame me for the deception. She'd tell everyone I'd lied about Emma being mine, that I'd perpetuated the fraud. She'd destroy both our reputations. So we made a silent pact. His hands trembled. She'd tolerate me raising Emma, her mistake. I'd tolerate her rejecting you, my consequence. We both sacrificed our daughters to protect our image. I stood to leave, disgusted by the whole twisted arrangement, but I turned back, needing to say one more thing. Emma didn't deserve what you both did to her either. You made her the favorite to punish me, but you also made her a pawn in your dysfunctional marriage. You let her believe a lie for 31 years because it was convenient. We were both your victims, Richard. You just chose which one to keep close and which one to send away. He didn't respond. He just sat there on that park bench, shoulders shaking, finally crying for the choices he'd made 3 decades ago. I walked away without looking back. By early May, the legal machinery was grinding toward its inevitable conclusion. Patricia had been in negotiations with both the district attorney's office and Diana's attorney, Theodore Blackwell, who'd begun to understand just how catastrophic his client's situation had become. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable: foundation embezzlement documented at $242,000, defamation with a clear trail to Diana's PR consultant friend, who'd planted the Business Journal article, filing a false police report proven by IP addresses, and obstruction of justice through fabricated court documents. If prosecuted fully and convicted on all counts, Diana faced 7 to 10 years in combined federal and state prison. The DA's office offered a plea bargain: plead guilty to reduce charges, fraud and false reporting, accept 3 to 5 years depending on cooperation and restitution, and avoid the public spectacle of a trial. Theodore Blackwell strongly recommended Diana accept. Going to trial would mean the DNA evidence becoming permanent public record, expert witnesses testifying about her pattern of deception and media coverage that would destroy whatever remained of her reputation. The plea deal was mercy she didn't deserve, but it was the only path that didn't end in complete annihilation. Simultaneously, Patricia negotiated the civil settlement. Her terms were precise and non-negotiable. Full restitution of the $100,000 I transferred to the foundation, $800,000 in damages for defamation and career harm based on my documented lost contract, $350,000 in legal fees I'd already paid, and $450,000 in punitive damages. Total $1.7 million. Diana had no assets to pay. The house was mortgaged beyond its value, retirement accounts had been liquidated to pay legal fees, savings were depleted. But Richard made an unexpected offer through his attorney. He would pay the full settlement amount from his personal trust fund, the inheritance from his late father, that Diana had never been able to touch. In exchange, I would sign a legal waiver releasing him from any further claims. It was a transaction, not an apology. No admission of paternal failure, no acknowledgement of the emotional damage he'd caused. Just money in exchange for legal closure. I accepted. The money mattered less than what it represented: acknowledgement of wrongdoing, formal consequence, the kind of accountability that had been absent my entire life. The plea hearing was scheduled for late May, in the same courthouse where the pretrial hearing had occurred. Judge Torres had consolidated the criminal and civil matters for efficiency, and the courtroom was packed, not with press, as those were still barred, but with court staff and legal observers who'd heard about the case. I sat in the front row with Patricia, while Diana stood before the bench with Theodore Blackwell at her side. Judge Torres read the charges in a clear, measured voice. Diana pleaded guilty in barely more than a whisper. Her shoulders hunched, her designer suit hanging loose as if she'd lost weight in the past month. The judge's sentencing statement was thorough and merciless. Mrs. Carter, you have engaged in a years-long pattern of deception, manipulation, and abuse. Not just toward your family, but toward the court system and public trust. You embezzled funds designated for charity to support vulnerable children. Funds you claimed would honor your late mother-in-law's memory. You fabricated evidence and filed false reports to criminalize an innocent person. You weaponized your social standing to destroy a young woman's career. The damage you've caused extends far beyond financial. Judge Torres paused, letting the weight of those words settle. I hereby sentence you to 5 years in the D.C. Department of Corrections, followed by 2 years supervised probation. You will pay full restitution of $1.7 million as agreed in the settlement. Additionally, I'm issuing a 10-year restraining order prohibiting any contact with Olivia Carter. Diana swayed slightly. Blackwell studied her arm, but she seemed beyond caring. 2 corrections officers approached to take her into custody. She was being remanded immediately, no bail pending transfer to the correctional facility. As they led her toward the side door in handcuffs, Diana turned and looked back at me one final time. I expected to see anger or defiance or even hatred. Instead, her face showed nothing but emptiness, as if the person inside had already vacated, leaving only a shell being led away to prison. I walked out of the courthouse into bright May sunshine, feeling simultaneously triumphant and hollow. Patricia had warned me that victory in family law cases rarely feels clean, and she was right. I'd won every legal battle, but the emotional cost was written in that empty expression on Diana's face. And the image of Emma. I couldn't shake her world shattered in a courtroom, her identity revealed as a 31-year lie. Outside, I discovered someone had leaked the story. Reporters clustered near the main entrance with cameras and microphones. Patricia guided me toward a side exit, shielding me from questions I had no interest in answering. But as we rounded the corner, I glimpsed a familiar figure standing apart from the crowd. Emma, watching from across the street, her face unreadable from this distance. Our eyes met for just a moment. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the late afternoon crowds, and I wondered if I'd ever see my sister again. The consequences unfolded over the following weeks, and I watched from a distance, learning about each development. Through Mr. Chen's periodic updates and the occasional Google search I couldn't resist conducting, Diana began serving her sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Alderson, West Virginia, a minimum security women's prison, about 250 miles from D.C. Mr. Chen obtained basic information through public records. She was now inmate number 47,829, housed in a dormitory style unit with 5 other women wearing standard-issue khaki uniforms instead of her designer suits. The woman who'd spent decades cultivating an image of effortless elegance was now living in a space smaller than her former walk-in closet. The social erasure happened quickly and quietly, the way it always does in Washington circles. I noticed at first on Facebook, where Diana's former friends began posting vague inspirational quotes about surrounding yourself with authentic people and knowing who your real friends are. The subtext was clear: they were distancing themselves from the scandal without directly acknowledging it. Diana's name disappeared from the Potomac Country Club roster. Her position on the National Symphony Orchestra Auxiliary Board vanished from their website. Charity gallows she'd attended for years somehow forgot to include her in their historical photo galleries. Washington society didn't condemn her publicly, that would be too crude. They simply pretended she'd never existed. Richard faced consequences of a different kind. His company's board of directors requested a meeting 2 weeks after Diana's sentencing, and by the end of June he'd announced his early retirement. The press release cited pursuing other interests and thanked him for his years of dedicated service. But everyone in their industry understood it was about the scandal. No major corporation wanted a senior executive whose wife was serving time for fraud and whose family secrets had been aired in court documents. His social network collapsed along with Diana's. The couples they'd socialized with for decades suddenly had perpetual scheduling conflicts. Golf partners stopped calling. Dinner invitations dried up. Richard filed for divorce in early July, while Diana was still adjusting to prison life, citing irreconcilable differences. The prenuptial agreement, which referenced Diana's failure to disclose Emma's true parentage, meant she received nothing in the settlement. I learned from Mr. Chen that Richard had sold the family home, the one with Emma's preserved bedroom, and my old room, converted to storage, and moved to a modest 2-bedroom condo in Arlington. The downsizing was partly financial, partly psychological. He'd started seeing a therapist according to court-mandated documentation related to the divorce. At 60 years old, he was finally confronting 32 years of moral cowardice and the choices that had destroyed 2 daughters' childhoods. But Emma's consequences were the ones that haunted me most, because she'd been the most innocent party in the entire mess. I learned about her broken engagement through a mutual acquaintance, who mentioned it casually, not knowing our connection. Her fiancé, a junior congressman's son with political ambitions, had quietly called it off. His family couldn't afford association with this level of scandal, not with his father's re-election campaign approaching. Emma had resigned from the foundation, now formally dissolved, with remaining funds returned to my account, and left Washington entirely. Mr. Chen tracked her to Portland, Oregon, where she'd rented a small apartment and was working as a freelance graphic designer. She'd legally changed her last name from Carter to Blake, reclaiming the identity of a biological father she'd never known but whose DNA she carried. I found myself occasionally checking her Instagram, which had once been a carefully curated display of her perfect life. Brunch photos, engagement announcement, designer handbags. Now it was sparse and unfiltered. Hiking trails in the Pacific Northwest, coffee shops with worn paperbacks, a photo of a scruffy terrier mixed with the caption, "Meet Murphy." My therapist suggested a dog. I think she was right. Emma was rebuilding an identity from scratch, and I felt a complicated mix of sympathy and guilt watching it happen from afar. In mid-June, I received an email that made me stare at my laptop screen for a full minute. The sender was the defense contractor's HR department, the same office that had terminated my contract 4 months earlier. Dear Ms. Carter, following the resolution of your legal matters and the restoration of your security clearance, we would like to discuss reinstating your contract position. The role remains available, and we believe your qualifications make you uniquely suited for this work. Please contact us at your earliest convenience to schedule a conversation. And the opportunity I'd thought was lost forever. The $2.5 million contract, the career achievement that had made my family notice me, was being offered again. My security clearance had been fully restored. The false accusations had been formally disproven. I could go back to the professional life I'd built, reclaim the success that Diana had tried to destroy. I closed the laptop without responding. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't sure I wanted what I'd always thought I wanted. Success had made my family come back. It had triggered this entire catastrophic chain of events. And sitting in Grandma's quiet house, I realized I needed to figure out who I was beyond my career achievements, beyond my family's dysfunction, beyond the girl who'd spent her whole life trying to prove she was worth something. I'd won every legal battle, but I still hadn't figured out what winning actually meant. I called the defense contractor's HR department 3 days after receiving their email. The conversation was brief and professional. I thanked them for the opportunity and explained that I decided to pursue a different direction in my career. The HR representative sounded surprised. $2.5 million contracts don't get declined often, but she accepted my decision graciously and wished me well. Instead, I reached out to my former manager at Deloitte and negotiated a part-time consulting arrangement. 20 hours per week, all remote, focusing on forensic audits for their existing clients. The income was a fraction of what the government contract would have paid, but it was enough. Between the consulting work and the conservative investments I'd made with the settlement, money generating roughly $60,000 annually, I could live comfortably without the pressure of high-stakes classified work. I stayed in Grandma's house and began the slow process of making it mine. Not erasing her presence, I kept her reading chair by the window, her collection of mystery novels, the photographs of us together, but updating the space to be both memorial and forward-looking. I repainted the kitchen in warm cream tones, replaced the warm carpets with hardwood floors, updated the bathroom fixtures. In the backyard, I planted a garden following the layout Grandma had always maintained, adding new varieties of roses she would have loved. The life I built was deliberately small. I joined a local book club that met twice a month at the library, surrounded by women in their 60s and 70s, who asked nothing about my past and cared only about whether I'd finished the month's selection. I volunteered at the community center, teaching basic financial literacy to seniors. In September, I adopted a gray tabby cat from the shelter, a 7-year-old female with knowing eyes. I named her Helen. In August, I began seeing Dr. Miriam Chen, a therapist specializing in family estrangement and complex trauma. The sessions were harder than I'd anticipated. Unpacking 27 years of rejection required examining every assumption I'd built my identity around. Dr. Chen introduced concepts that felt revolutionary in their simplicity: chosen family. The idea that the people who matter most are those who choose to love you, rather than those obligated by blood. Radical acceptance. The practice of accepting that some people, even parents, are incapable of the love you deserved, and that this incapacity is their limitation, not your failure. You're grieving, Dr. Chen told me during one session in October, not for the family you lost, because you never truly had them. You're grieving for the family you deserved and never got. That's a different kind of loss, and it's profound. She was right. The grief came in waves, sometimes triggered by seeing a mother and daughter laughing together at the grocery store, sometimes appearing without warning while I was washing dishes or reading in Grandma's chair. But it was necessary grief, the kind that clears space for something new to grow. Richard sent emails occasionally, never asking for forgiveness, just offering information. I've been attending therapy twice a week. I sold the house and moved to a smaller place. Emma changed her name legally. I thought you should know. I think about you every day and wonder if that matters. I read each one, but never responded. I wasn't ready to grant him absolution, but I also wasn't interested in perpetuating anger. The emails accumulated in a folder I'd labeled, "Someday Maybe," a holding space for a relationship I didn't know how to define yet. Once a month, usually on Sunday mornings, I visited Grandma's grave. I'd bring fresh flowers, seasonal varieties, the kind she loved, and sit on the bench nearby, talking to her as if she could hear. You were right about everything, Grandma. The truth did set me free. But freedom feels lonely sometimes. I miss you. I miss having someone who loved me without conditions. No word came from Emma during those months, and I respected that silence. Some wounds need distance to heal. I'd shattered her entire identity in a courtroom. The least I could do was give her space to rebuild it without my interference. December arrived with early snow coating Grandma's garden in white. On the 10th, I came home from the grocery store to find mail in my box. Bill's holiday catalogs and one handwritten envelope with a Portland postmark. Emma's handwriting. I recognized it from years of watching her write thank you notes at family gatherings. Her letters carefully formed and slightly slanted. I carried the envelope inside, set it on the kitchen table, and made coffee. I didn't drink. I sat in Grandma's chair. Helen curled in my lap and stared at that envelope for 2 hours. My name and address in Emma's careful script. No return address. Just a Portland postmark and the weight of everything unsaid between us. Part of me wanted to burn it unopened to preserve the fragile peace I'd built. Part of me desperately needed to know what she'd written, whether she hated me or understood me or something more complicated than either. The envelope sat there waiting while I tried to decide which part of me to listen to. I finally opened the envelope as dusk settled over the neighborhood. The winter light fading to blue-gray outside the kitchen windows. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the pages. 3 sheets of cream stationery covered in Emma's careful handwriting. The letters were neat but occasionally wavered as if her hand had shaken. While writing, suggesting this wasn't a first or even second draft, the letter began, "Olivia, I don't know if you'll read this. I don't know if I deserve for you to read it. I've started this letter 17 times in the past 3 months, and every version felt wrong, too defensive, too apologetic, too self-pitying. So, I'm just going to write honestly." Emma explained that she'd been in intensive therapy since June, twice weekly. Sessions with a specialist in identity reconstruction and family trauma. She was processing what it meant to learn at 31 that her entire understanding of herself had been built on lies. Her therapist had suggested writing to me not to seek forgiveness. "I don't have the right to ask for that," Emma wrote, "but to practice accountability, to acknowledge harm done even if it couldn't be undone." The middle section of the letter was painfully honest, and I had to set it down twice to collect myself before continuing. I was 31 years old when I learned the truth, but I wasn't innocent. I knew Mom treated you differently. I saw you being sent away at 7 while I stayed. I watched you graduate alone while we went to garden parties. I benefited from your exclusion every single day, and I told myself it was because I was a better daughter, more deserving, easier to love. She continued, "That was a lie I chose to believe because it made me feel special instead of complicit. I could have questioned why you were gone. I could have demanded Mom explain. I could have insisted you were included. But I didn't because your absence made my life more comfortable. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm still learning to forgive myself. I just wanted you to know I see it now. I see all of it. I see what I participated in even as a child and what I perpetuated as an adult." Giga. Emma described her current life in Portland with unflinching detail. She lived in a small one-bedroom apartment in the Alberta Arts District, worked as a freelance graphic designer for small, nonprofits and local businesses, made enough to cover rent and groceries. But nothing like the lifestyle she'd had before. She attended a support group for adult children of narcissistic parents where she was learning to identify the manipulation patterns she'd internalized. She was building friendships slowly, carefully with people who knew nothing about the relationship with her for who she was now, rather than who she'd pretended to be. I've had to grieve my entire identity, she wrote. Not just learning that Marcus Blake was my biological father, though that's enormous and strange and I'm still processing it, but realizing that the person I thought I was, Diana's Princess Richard's golden child, the daughter who deserved everything while you deserved nothing, was a fiction constructed through your pain. Every privilege I enjoyed came at the cost of your exile. I don't know how to reconcile being both a victim of their lies and a beneficiary of their cruelty. The letter ended with an offer that felt fragile and genuine. I don't know if we can ever be sisters in any real sense. We didn't grow up together, we don't share childhood memories beyond awkward holiday visits, and we've hurt each other. Or I've hurt you mostly. But if you ever want to talk, not to fix anything, or pretend we're suddenly close, just to acknowledge each other's existence as real people instead of symbols in a family tragedy, I'm here. No pressure, no expectations. Just possibility. Emma Blake. I read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of hurt and honesty. I sat in Grandma's kitchen as the winter afternoon light faded completely. Hell and purring in my lap, and tried to process what Emma was offering. Not reconciliation, not sisterhood, but acknowledgement. The possibility of being strangers who shared DNA, instead of family who shared nothing. I pulled out my laptop and began typing a response. The first draft was too cold, too clinical. I deleted it. The second was too warm, too forgiving of things I wasn't ready to forgive. I deleted that too. The third attempted to explain my entire emotional journey and became a manifesto. Delete? Finally, I wrote something short and true. Emma, I don't hate you. I never did. But I'm not ready to trust you. And I don't know if I ever will be. What happened to us happened before we had any power to stop it. But what we did with that situation, you accepting privilege, me accepting exile, those were choices we made. Maybe someday we can try being strangers who share complicated DNA instead of family who share nothing but trauma. For now, that's enough. Take care of yourself. Olivia. I reread it twice, made one small edit changing complicated DNA to just DNA, then hit send before I could reconsider. The email whooshed away into the digital void. I closed my laptop and sat in the gathering darkness of Grandma's kitchen, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Not closure exactly, but perhaps the beginning of something that might eventually become peace. Emma and I exchanged a few brief emails over the next month. Nothing substantial, just acknowledgments of existence. She mentioned the therapy dog she'd adopted. I mentioned the renovations on Grandma's house. The exchanges were careful, distant, like two people learning to speak after years of silence, but they felt honest, and that mattered more than warmth. In January, I made a decision about the settlement money. I'd been living off of the investment returns and my part-time consulting income, leaving the principal mostly untouched. The money felt heavy, somehow tainted by its origin in Diana's fraud and desperation. I wanted to transform it into something clean. I established a legitimate nonprofit and named it the Helen Carter Foundation for Overlooked Children. The mission was specific and personal, providing full-ride college scholarships to academically excellent students from fractured families who demonstrated resilience despite parental neglect or rejection. The irony wasn't lost on me, using money from a fraudulent foundation to create a real one, but it felt right. Like turning poison into medicine, like honoring Grandma by helping children who reminded me of myself. I hired a professional nonprofit administrator, a woman named Sarah Martinez, who had 15 years of experience running scholarship programs. I didn't want family involved, didn't want friends on the board, just complete independence and professional integrity. I assembled a board of education professionals, a high school guidance counselor, a college admissions director, a social worker who specialized in family trauma. Together we created rigorous selection criteria and committed $1 million of the settlement to an endowment that would sustain the foundation for decades. The first year launched in spring, with 10 scholarships of $50,000 each, covering 4 years of college, including tuition, housing, books, and crucially mental health counseling. We received over 300 applications. I reviewed them anonymously alongside the board, and the stories broke my heart in familiar ways. A 17-year-old girl from Baltimore, whose parents had forgotten her 16th birthday entirely. Because they were in the middle of a bitter divorce, each assuming the other would handle it. A boy from rural Virginia, whose father had told him college was unnecessary for people like us, and refused to fill out financial aid forms. A non-binary student from Pennsylvania, whose family had stopped speaking to them when they came out, but who'd maintained a 4 gigapascals through sheer determination, working 20 hours a week at a grocery store to save for application fees. Reading those applications felt like reading chapters from my own story written by different hands. We selected 10 recipients based on academic achievement, demonstrated resilience, and the quality of their essays about overcoming family adversity. The award ceremony took place in June at a small university auditorium near D.C. The 10 students sat in the front row with their chosen supporters, grandparents, teachers, foster parents, friends who'd become family. I noticed that not one of them had brought their parents. When it was time for me to speak, I stood at the podium and looked at those young faces, guarded, hopeful, afraid to believe this was real, and saw myself reflected in every expression. I was told for most of my life that I didn't matter. I began, my voice steady despite the emotion tightening my throat. Not explicitly, but through silence, through absence, through being made invisible. One person believed differently. My grandmother taught me that your family's inability to see your worth doesn't diminish it. You are not defined by who failed to love you. You're defined by how you choose to love yourself and others. I paused, meeting each student's eyes. This foundation exists because someone invested in me when I had nothing. I'm investing in you. Not because you need saving, but because you deserve recognition. You've already saved yourselves. This scholarship is just the world catching up to what you already knew: you matter. Several students were crying by the time I finished. The audience applauded. Afterward, the recipients lined up to shake my hand, each one gripping tightly, eyes bright with tears and determination. A girl from Philadelphia hugged me without warning and whispered, "Thank you for seeing us." I hugged her back and understood in that moment why Grandma had loved me so fiercely. Because loving someone the world overlooks is an act of revolutionary defiance. I stayed afterward talking with students and their supporters, feeling emotionally exhausted, but genuinely happy for the first time in years. This was what healing looked like. Not forgetting the pain, but using it to prevent others from suffering the same way. As the auditorium emptied and I gathered my things, I noticed someone standing in the back near the exit. A woman in her early 30s with dark hair, wearing jeans and a simple sweater, watching quietly. "Emma." Our eyes met across the empty rows of seats. She raised one hand in a small tentative wave, then she mouthed 2 words. "Can we talk?" I stood there holding my folder of scholarship materials, and felt my carefully constructed boundaries wavering. We'd exchanged emails, maintained polite distance, but seeing her here at this ceremony, that was so deeply personal, felt like crossing into different territory. I nodded slowly. Emma walked down the aisle toward me, and I wondered what we'd possibly have to say to each other now. We sat on a bench outside the auditorium, June evening light filtering through the trees overhead, an awkward 3 feet of space between us. Emma looked different from the polished socialite I'd known. Her hair was simpler, her clothing casual, her makeup minimal. She looked more real, somehow less like a carefully curated image. "I saw the foundation announcement online," she said quietly. "Your name was listed as founder. I needed to see what you'd built. I needed to see what actual goodness looks like, I think. After spending 30 years in whatever our family was." I nodded, not sure how to respond to that. Emma continued, filling the silence with updates I hadn't asked for, but was curious to hear. She'd been in Portland for a year now, working steadily as a freelance designer, still seeing her therapist twice a week. She'd made a few genuine friends, people who knew nothing about the Carter scandal, and liked her for reasons that had nothing to do with her last name or connections. "I'm dating someone," she said, a small smile touching her lips. "A librarian. His name is David. He's kind and quiet, and asked about my family on our second date." I said, "It's complicated," and he just nodded and changed the subject. He didn't push. I think that's when I knew I could trust him. "That sounds nice," I said, meaning it. The conversation shifted into deeper territory when I asked what I'd been wondering since the courtroom. "Have you had contact with Mom or Dad?" Emma shook her head. "I wrote to Mom once, about 6 months into her sentence. I needed to tell her that what she did, not just the legal stuff, but the lifetime of lying, was unforgivable. I needed her to know that she didn't just hurt you. She hurt me too by making my entire identity a fiction." She paused. She wrote back, a long letter apparently, but I didn't open it. "It's sitting in a drawer in my apartment. I'm not ready. Maybe I never will be." "And Dad?" I asked. "Richard," she corrected gently. And I understood he wasn't her father anymore. Not biologically, Maybe not emotionally either. He sends emails every few weeks. Bank statements showing he's paying your settlement updates about his therapy apologies. I don't know what to do with. I respond occasionally. Very brief. A sentence or two. I'm not cutting him off, but I'm not absolving him either. He's just there, existing in my peripheral vision. I understood that too. The emails sitting in my someday maybe folder serve the same purpose, acknowledging existence without granting forgiveness. Emma took a breath, gathering courage for something. Can I ask you something? And you can tell me it's none of my business, okay? Do you think we can ever be sisters? Real ones, not the performative kind Mom created where I was the golden child. And you were nothing. I considered the question carefully, knowing that a flippant answer would hurt us both. I don't know, I said honestly. We don't have a foundation, Emma. No shared childhood memories that weren't toxic. No inside jokes. No history of protecting each other or being there for each other. We're essentially strangers who happen to share a traumatic origin story. I saw her face fall slightly and I continued. But maybe that's enough to start. Not as sisters trying to recreate what we never had or pretend we're suddenly close, but as two people who survived the same wreckage and are choosing to acknowledge each other as real people rather than symbols. No expectations. No obligations. Just possibility? Emma nodded slowly, considering. I'll take possibility. That's more than I thought I'd get. We sat in silence for a moment, watching students cross the campus in the fading light. I should go, Emma said, standing. My flight back to Portland is early tomorrow. You flew here just for this? I asked, surprised. I needed to see it. To see you doing something good with what they tried to destroy. It helped somehow. Seeing that pain can become something else. We walked toward the parking lot together, and at her rental car, we faced each other awkwardly. Emma pulled out her phone. Can we exchange numbers, new ones? I've changed mine 3 times for privacy. Me too, I said. And we typed our new numbers into each other's phones. I'm planning to visit DC in September, Emma said. There's a design conference I want to attend. Would you be willing to meet for coffee? Just coffee. Low stakes. I surprised myself by agreeing. Yes, I'd like that. No promises, Emma said. No pressure. Just coffee. Just coffee, I echoed. As she drove away, I stood in the parking lot watching her taillights disappear. And I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not closure, we were too far from that. But an opening, perhaps. The possibility that family isn't only what you're born into, the people whose DNA you share by accident, but also what you choose to build with intention and honesty. I drove home to Grandma's house to Helen waiting in the window and realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't alone by default. I was alone by choice. And that choice included the possibility of letting people in when I was ready. Maybe Emma would be one of those people. Maybe she wouldn't. But the possibility itself felt like progress. Emma and I met for coffee in September when she came to DC for her conference. We sat in a quiet cafe near DuPont Circle for an hour, talking carefully about neutral topics, her design work, my foundation, the weather in Portland versus DC. It was awkward, but not hostile. Tentative, but genuine. When we parted, we hugged briefly, and it felt like progress. A week after Emma returned to Portland, I received a letter with a return address. I recognized Federal Correctional Institution, Alderson, West Virginia. Diana's handwriting on the envelope still elegant, despite the institutional stationery. I stared at it for a full day before opening it, the envelope sitting on my kitchen counter like something that might explode if handled incorrectly. When I finally opened it, Diana's letter was surprisingly direct, stripped of the manipulation I'd expected. Olivia, I don't expect you to read this, respond to it, or forgive me. I'm writing because my therapist here. Yes, even in prison we have therapy says I need to practice accountability without expecting absolution. So here it is, without justification or excuse. I was a terrible mother to you. She continued with an honesty I'd never heard from her before. Not because you were difficult or unlovable, but because you reminded me of everything I'd sacrificed. My choice, my agency, my first love. When I married Richard, I was already pregnant with Emma. His family knew, my family knew, and we all agreed to the lie. I thought I was making a practical choice, security over passion, stability over love. But every time I looked at you, Richard's actual biological child, I saw the permanence of my decision made visible. The letter's psychological insight was uncomfortable in its clarity. Emma was my past mistake, evidence of a moment when I'd followed my heart instead of my family's expectations. You were my future prison, proof that I'd chosen the cage and locked myself inside. That's monstrously unfair to say about an innocent child. but I couldn't separate you from my resentment of the life I chose. I made you pay for my cowardice. I failed you in every way a mother can fail. I own that now." She didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't request a response. Just acknowledged her failures with a starkness that felt genuine even if it came 35 years too late. I read the letter twice, then brought it to my next therapy session with Dr. Chen. She read it silently, then looked at me over her reading glasses. "How do you feel about this?" "I don't know," I admitted. Part of me is angry that it took prison for her to be honest. Part of me recognizes that at least she's being honest now. "Do you feel the need to respond?" Dr. Chen asked. I considered the question carefully. No, this isn't a conversation, it's her confession. She's processing her guilt, which is her work, not mine. I can acknowledge that she's growing without needing to be part of that growth. Her accountability is for her healing, not mine. Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. "That's very mature, Olivia. You're allowed to witness her evolution without participating in it." I filed the letter in a folder when I got home, neither destroying it nor responding to it. It existed as a record of truth spoken, but it didn't require my engagement. Later that week, an email from Richard arrived. "Olivia, I heard you met with Emma in June and again in September. I'm glad. You both deserved better than what Diana and I gave you. I don't ask for a relationship or forgiveness. Just for you to know, I'm proud of who you've become, despite us, not because of us. You built yourself from nothing we provided, and that takes a strength I never had. Dad." I saved the email in my someday maybe folder, which I'd started thinking of less as a holding space for unfinished business, and more as a record of people trying even if their efforts came too late to repair what they'd broken. On December 16th, my 35th birthday, I received a notification from Richard's attorney. I opened it, expecting more legal paperwork related to the settlement, but instead found something I'd forgotten about entirely: the trust fund Richard had mentioned during our park bench conversation. The letter explained in formal legal language what Richard had done 35 years ago. "Your father established this trust in 1996, the year you were born, with funds from his inheritance. Per his instructions, the trust was structured to mature on your 35th birthday to protect it from any family conflict or divorce proceedings. The current value, including accrued interest and conservative investments, $1.2 million. I stared at that number, processing what it meant. Richard had set up this trust when I was an infant, before I'd been sent away, before the years of rejection and silence. He'd been planning my financial security for 35 years, protecting money I didn't know existed from a mother who would have tried to control it. He'd given me an escape route. He just hadn't given me a reason to leave sooner. The irony was almost unbearable. He'd planned for my independence while participating in my exclusion. He'd secured my future while stealing my childhood. I sat in Grandma's kitchen with Helen in my lap, looking at the trust fund statement, and realized I didn't know whether to be grateful or furious. Maybe I was both. I spent my 35th birthday at Grandma's house, now fully my own. I'd finished the renovations in November, refinished floors, updated kitchen, new paint throughout, but kept the things that mattered. Her reading chair still sat by the window. Her garden, dormant for winter, waited beneath the snow for spring. The gathering was small by design. Emma flew in from Portland, arriving the night before with a bottle of wine and visible nervousness about whether she'd be welcome. 2 friends from my consulting work came, people who knew the broad strokes of my story, but didn't define me by it. Dr. Chen attended, our therapeutic relationship having formally concluded. In October, transitioning into something that felt like genuine friendship. And Mr. Chen, the private investigator who'd uncovered so much truth, had become an unlikely mentor figure, someone who understood the complexity of family secrets. Richard wasn't there. I wasn't ready for that, might never be. But I'd sent him a brief email acknowledging the trust fund. "Thank you for thinking ahead even when you couldn't act in the moment. I'm using the money to expand the foundation." His response had been characteristically brief. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd do." I over birthday cake chocolate. Grandma's favorite. Emma asked about my plans for the trust fund. I explained I was endowing the Helen Carter Foundation with $600,000, doubling our capacity to 20 scholarships annually, instead of 10. The remaining $600,000 I'd keep for security, travel, and whatever life brought. Emma set down her fork carefully. "I've been saving money. Not much, but some. I'd like to contribute $10,000 to the foundation." She looked at me directly. "Not to buy my way into your good graces, but because I want to be part of building something good, instead of just inheriting broken things." I considered her offer, understanding what it meant. Emma didn't have much freelance design work, paid modestly, and $10,000 represented real sacrifice. "I accept," I said. We shook hands across the table like business partners forming an alliance. which felt more honest than pretending to be sisters we'd never been. After the guests left and the dishes were washed, I drove to the cemetery 2 miles away. The December evening was cold and clear stars visible above the bare trees. I brought winter roses, Grandma's favorite, and sat on the bench near her grave. They all remembered I existed, Grandma, I said aloud, my breath visible in the cold air. Diana from her prison cell writing letters about regret, Richard with his secret trust fund and therapy appointments, Emma showing up to my foundation event, and my birthday asking if we can build something new. They all finally see me. I paused watching the last light fade from the western sky. And you know what I realized? I don't need them to see me anymore. Because I see myself. You taught me that my worth doesn't come from their approval. It comes from knowing who I am and what I'm capable of. I'm Olivia Carter, not because of my father's name, but because I'm the granddaughter of Helen Carter, the woman who loved me when no one else would. And that's enough. I sat there until the cold seeped through my coat, then returned to my car. Before starting it, I pulled out my phone and found Richard's contact. I began typing. Dad, I'm not ready to meet in person, and I may never be. But I want you to know that I'm choosing not to carry anger anymore. Not for your benefit, but for mine. What you did, the cowardice, the silence, the abandonment shaped me in painful ways. But it also taught me who I never want to become. I won't thank you for the lessons, but I'll acknowledge they made me stronger. If someday I decide I want a relationship, I'll reach out. Until then, I wish you well in your own healing. Olivia. I sent it before I could reconsider, and felt something release in my chest. Snow began falling as I drove home, soft flakes catching in my headlights. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Thank you for letting me be there today. I know I don't deserve your kindness, but I'm grateful for it. Maybe next time I visit, we can try dinner. No pressure. I smiled and typed back. Maybe? Let's see. I pulled into the driveway of my house, not Grandma's house anymore but mine, and saw warm lights glowing through the windows. Helen sat in the front window, her gray tail twitching as she watched for me. Inside waited leftover cake, a good book, and the quiet piece of a life I'd built entirely on my own terms. They'd remembered I existed. Diana from behind bars, Richard with money hidden for 35 years, Emma by showing up when she didn't have to. But I'd never forgotten myself. I was the child who survived their neglect, the woman who exposed their lies, the granddaughter who honored the one person who loved me unconditionally. I was Olivia Carter, and I was enough. It's been a year since that birthday gathering, since I sat at Grandma's grave and finally understood that I didn't need my family's recognition to validate my existence. People often ask me if it was worth it, the legal battle, the public exposure, the pain of destroying the family I never really had. The answer is complicated, but ultimately yes, because the alternative was spending the rest of my life pretending their lies were truth, carrying their shame as if it were mine, and allowing their dysfunction to define my worth. Today, the Helen Carter Foundation has awarded 127 scholarships to overlooked children across the country. Each application I read reminds me that I'm not alone in my story. There are thousands of children growing up right now, feeling invisible in their own families, wondering what they did wrong, trying to earn love that should have been freely given. The foundation can't give them the childhoods they deserved, but it can give them a chance to build futures they choose. Diana is still serving her sentence. She'll be eligible for parole in 18 months. I don't know if I'll attend that hearing or write a statement. I don't know if my presence matters anymore. She writes occasionally short letters, always apologetic, never asking for anything. I read them, acknowledge them in my mind, and file them away. Her growth is real, I think, but it's hers to manage. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't require relationship, and accountability doesn't require my participation in someone else's healing journey. Richard sold his condo and moved to a smaller town in Pennsylvania. He volunteers at a literacy program for underprivileged children, which feels like his own attempt at redemption. We exchange emails every few months, brief updates, nothing deep. He sent me a photo recently of a little girl he's been tutoring, a child who reminds him of me, he said. I appreciated the gesture, but didn't respond with the warmth he might have hoped for. Some bridges take decades to rebuild, if they can be rebuilt at all. Emma and I have developed something that isn't quite sisterhood, but feels more authentic than what we had before. She visits DC 3 or 4 times a year, and we meet for coffee or dinner. We talk about our work, our lives, our separate healing processes. Last month she told me she's been seeing her therapist less frequently, down to once a month, because she's finally feeling like herself instead of the person Diana created. She still struggles with identity questions, still has moments where she feels like an imposter in her own life, but she's building something real that matters. The defense contractor reached out again 6 months ago with another contract offer. I declined again, more certain this time. High-stakes classified work isn't what I need anymore. I've found purpose in the foundation, in teaching financial literacy to young people in the quiet consulting work that lets me use my skills without consuming my identity. Success, I've learned, isn't about the size of the contract or the prestige of the position. It's about alignment between your values and your actions. But here's what I really want you to understand. What I wish someone had told 7-year-old me standing in grandma's doorway, watching her parents drive away your family's inability to love you correctly, is not evidence of your unworthiness. It's evidence of their limitations, their trauma, their dysfunction, their choices. You are not responsible for fixing people who broke themselves long before you existed. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep people warm who would never do the same for you. The truth will cost you. It cost me my career temporarily, my reputation, my relationship with people I'd hoped might change. But the truth also freed me. It freed Emma to discover who she actually is beyond Diana's manipulation. It even freed Richard to finally confront his cowardice. And most importantly, it freed me from the burden of pretending that my rejection was somehow my fault. I've learned that family is not defined by DNA or legal documents or shared last names. Family is defined by who shows up, who stays when things get difficult, who celebrates your success without jealousy and supports your pain without judgment. Grandma was my family. Dr. Chen is family. The scholarship recipients who send me updates about their lives are family. Emma is becoming family slowly, carefully on terms we're defining together. Some people will tell you to forgive and forget to take the high road to preserve family peace at any cost. But peace without truth is just pretending. Forgiveness without accountability is just enabling, and family that requires you to diminish yourself for their comfort isn't family, it's performance. I'm Olivia Carter. I'm 36 years old. I run a foundation that helps children my family tried to erase. I live in the house where the only person who truly loved me taught me that I was enough exactly as I was. I've transformed the worst thing that ever happened to me into something that helps prevent it from happening to others. And if you're watching this because some part of my story resonated with your own experience of family rejection, of being overlooked, of wondering why you weren't chosen or loved or valued, I want you to know you are not alone. Your pain is valid, your anger is justified, and your decision to seek truth, to demand accountability, to walk away from people who hurt you, that's not selfish. That's survival. I'd love to hear your story. Have you experienced family estrangement? Have you had to choose between truth and peace? How did you rebuild your sense of worth after people who should have loved you couldn't or wouldn't? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your story matters. You matter. And if this story moved you, if it helped you feel less alone, please subscribe to this channel. Share this with someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is tell the truth about family dysfunction, because silence protects the wrong people. They remembered I existed. But more importantly, I never forgot myself. And neither should you. Thanks for watching. Take care. Good luck.